By the time the Depression finally loosened its grip on the country, millions of American households had survived not because of anything counted in the unemployment figures, but because of an economy built almost entirely by women, a shadow economy of barter, credit, and invisible labor that no economist of the era ever thought to measure. Historians would later estimate that in some communities, more cash changed hands through this hidden network of women than through the wages their husbands brought home. Almost none of it was ever written down. The kitchen is warm, though the rest of the house is not. Outside, the light has the thin grey quality of a Tuesday in late winter, the kind of morning that arrives without ceremony and asks nothing of you except to be survived. You have already been awake for an hour. There is a coffee tin on the shelf, with a little less coffee in it than there was last week, and a coffee tin behind that one, hidden with something else in it entirely. Coins, mostly, a few folded bills, money your husband does not know exists because you earned it yourself in ways that never once appeared on any paycheck, any tax form, any ledger kept by any bank in town. This is the story of that second tin, of the mending baskets and the curb markets and the spare rooms rented out under the stairs, of egg money and butter money and the sewing circle that quietly kept half the block afloat, of a whole economy that ran underneath the official one, invisible to the men who thought they alone were holding the family together and essential to the fact that the family was held together at all. Before the story properly begins, it is worth sitting with that thought for a moment. The version of the Depression most people know is a story about men, about breadlines and lost jobs and shuttered factories. This is the other half of it, the half that was never counted and the half that, in a great many households, was the only thing standing between the family and true ruin. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, and this particular one has a great deal of quiet history tucked inside it. Before we settle in, one small note. This story, along with the rest of the library, is also available as an audiobook on Spotify if you would rather drift off to the sound of a voice than a screen. The link is in the description and pinned in the comments whenever you want it. Now, dim the light if you have not already, let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on, and let yourself sink into a kitchen in the winter of 1932. There is nothing you need to remember or track as this unfolds. Simply let the details arrive one at a time, the way they would on any ordinary morning, and let your own thoughts drift wherever they please alongside them. The coffee tin sits on the third shelf, behind the flour and the baking soda, close enough to reach without a stool, and far enough back that it takes a deliberate motion to find it, never an accidental one. You keep it there on purpose. Everything in this kitchen is kept somewhere on purpose. There is no room in a house like this for anything to simply happen to be anywhere. Inside the tin, folded into a square no bigger than a matchbook, is a slip of paper with numbers on it, written small in pencil, the kind of handwriting a person uses when they expect to erase and rewrite it many times before the week is through. Rent, coal, flour, shoes for the boy, who has, with the thoughtless cruelty of a growing child, outgrown his good pair for the second time this year. Doctor, if it comes to that, though you are hoping fiercely that it does not, every dollar that comes into this house passes, at some point, through your hands and onto this slip of paper, and you have become, in the space of 2 hard years, something between a bookkeeper and a magician, because the amount of money coming in has shrunk and the number of mouths at your table has not. This is not incidental work. It is not a small feminine habit, tidily separate from the real business of surviving the Depression. It is the real business. Extension agents from the Department of Agriculture had, in the years just before the crash, begun traveling from county to county teaching farm and town women alike a formal discipline they called household management, complete with pamphlets and worksheets and envelope systems for dividing a paycheck the moment it arrived, before it could slip through your fingers into something less necessary than rent. Few of the men who received those paychecks ever saw the pamphlets. Fewer still would have known what to do with an envelope system if they had. This was women's work in the truest sense, meaning it was serious, technical, unglamorous labor that happened to be assigned to women and was, for that reason alone, treated by nearly everyone as though it barely counted as work at all. You have learned to stretch a dollar the way other people learn a trade, through repetition and failure and the occasional small triumph nobody but you will ever notice. A pound of ground beef, which used to be a Tuesday supper, now becomes 3 suppers, folded into biscuits and stretched with oats and onion until the meat is more suggestion than substance. Coffee grounds are used twice before they are thrown away, and some weeks a third time, weak and grey and only barely recognizable as coffee, but hot, and that has to be enough. You have become fluent in a private arithmetic that has no textbook and no teacher, only the unforgiving math of what is left in the tin against what is still owed by Friday. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in this that has nothing to do with your back or your hands, the 2 parts of you that ache from every other chore in this house. This exhaustion lives somewhere behind your eyes, in the part of your mind that is never fully at rest, always quietly running sums, always calculating whether the coal will last until payday, or whether you will need to go without heat in the front room 2 nights this week instead of 1. It is a kind of labor no one sees you doing, because it produces no visible result beyond the fact that the family somehow is still fed and still housed, and a family that is fed and housed does not look from the outside like the product of anyone's careful engineering. It looks like ordinary life, only you know how much invisible calculation holds ordinary life together. Your husband believes, and you have let him go on believing, that his wages are what keep this house running. In the strictest sense, he is not wrong. His wages are the foundation, the largest single number on your slip of paper, and you are grateful for them in a way you do not often say aloud, because gratitude, spoken too plainly in a hard year, can start to sound like an accounting of who has given more. But his wages, on their own, would not stretch across this month. You know this the way you know the weight of a coal scuttle before you lift it. He does not know it, and you have decided, quietly, and without any particular drama, that he does not need to. There is a mercy in that decision, and there is also, if you are honest with yourself in the dark quiet after everyone else is asleep, a kind of power in it too. The household runs on a calculation only you can see the whole of. This second tin, tucked behind the first, holds the money that makes the difference between his wages simply existing and his wages actually being enough. Every dollar in it has a story attached, a specific transaction you performed yourself outside of anything he would recognize as employment. Some of it came from eggs sold to a neighbor 2 streets over. Some of it came from a dress altered for the schoolteacher's daughter, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem with stitches so small, and even she asked, twice, whether you had trained as a professional seamstress somewhere before you married. You had not. You had trained the way most women of your generation trained at your own mother's knee in a kitchen very much like this one, learning a craft that the wider economy had no official category for and no wage scale to measure, and yet a craft that, in this house, in this year, was worth actual money in an actual tin. What is remarkable, looking back at these years from any distance at all, is how completely this second economy operated outside the vision of the people who were supposed to be watching the country's economic health. The unemployment figures counted men out of work. They did not count, could not have counted, the thousands upon thousands of women quietly generating income through work that had no job title, no employer, no time clock, nothing that a census taker's questionnaire had a box for. If you had been asked in 1933 whether you were employed, you would very likely have said no, because that is what the question meant to you and to nearly everyone who asked it. And yet, on any given week, you might earn more in actual cash than a man working reduced hours at the mill. The economy simply had no word for what you were doing, and so, for the purposes of official history, you were not doing it at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness folded into that invisibility, though loneliness may not be quite the right word for it. It is closer to a private, permanent quiet, the sense that the truest and most demanding parts of your effort will never be spoken of at the supper table, never be acknowledged by the men who benefit from them, never appear in any newspaper account of how families like yours managed to survive these years. And yet there is something else folded in alongside that quiet, something you would be reluctant to call pride out loud, but that sits in your chest very much like pride does. You built this. The second tin did not appear on its own. You built it, coin by coin, dollar by dollar, out of skills nobody paid to teach you and labor nobody thought to count, and it has kept this family from the kind of ruin that swallowed the family 2 doors down last winter, when the husband's hours were cut and there was no second tin behind the flour to catch the fall. You close the tin now, slide it back behind the flour where it belongs, and reach instead for the first one, the visible one, the one with today's coffee in it. There is a whole day of ordinary work still ahead of you. Chores that will look to anyone glancing in the window exactly like the chores every farm and town wife in the country is doing this same grey morning. What they will not see, what almost no one ever saw, is the careful, constant arithmetic running underneath all of it, the private ledger only you keep, the household bank with no name and no charter and no teller but you. You may find yourself wondering as the morning goes on just how many other kitchens on this street hold a second tin exactly like this one, sitting quietly behind someone else's flour, known only to the woman who filled it. Thursday afternoons, the front room fills with women. It happens so gradually you could almost miss the moment it becomes a gathering rather than a scattering of separate errands. Mrs. Hollis arrives first, always, with a basket of mending balanced on her hip and a roll of thread tucked into her coat pocket like a secret. Then, the Delacroix girl, barely 20 and newly married, still learning the difference between a running stitch and a back stitch, though she is too proud most days to admit it. Then, one by one, the others until there are 6 or 7 women seated in a loose circle around your front room, needles moving, voices low, the whole scene looking, to anyone glancing through the window, like nothing more than a pleasant social hour among neighbours. It is not nothing more than that. But it is also, underneath the pleasant surface, a functioning market, complete with prices, negotiations, and a running tally that exists nowhere on paper and entirely inside the memories of the women sitting in this room. The exchange works like this. Mrs. Hollis, whose eyesight remains sharp and whose hand is famously steady, does fine hemming and lace repair that no one else on the block can match. In exchange for an afternoon spent letting out the seams of 3 growing children's coats, she does not ask for cash, which is scarce for everyone in this room and would feel somehow like an insult to offer between neighbours. She asks instead for a dozen jars of your good tomato preserves, put up last September, or perhaps an afternoon of your own labour watching her youngest while she visits her sister across town. The currency here is skill, time and goods, traded directly, one woman to another, with no bank and no interest and no record kept anywhere but in the careful social memory of the group, which functions in its way with more precision than any ledger. Everyone in this circle knows exactly what she is owed and exactly what she owes, down to the last favour, and disputes are vanishingly rare because a woman who fails to make good on a debt in this economy pays for it in a currency far more costly than money. She pays for it in reputation, and in this smaller community, reputation is very nearly everything. What is happening in this front room, though none of the women sitting in it would ever use the word, is a barter economy running in parallel to the cash economy their husbands participate in downtown. Historians studying this period later would find that these informal networks of skilled exchange, largely invisible in any official record, may have moved as much real value through working class and rural communities during the worst Depression years as small local banks did, simply because the banks in so many towns had failed or drastically restricted lending, while a circle of women with needles and time never once closed its doors. There is a particular kind of expertise on display in this room that the wider world has simply never thought to price correctly. Mrs. Hollis's hemming, done properly, done invisibly, is a skill that took her the better part of 2 decades to perfect, refined through thousands of hours of practice that no employer ever paid her a wage to accumulate. The Delacroix girl, still learning, understands intuitively that she is receiving an education here every bit as real as anything taught in a classroom, an apprenticeship with no diploma at the end of it, and no name for the trade she is learning, because the trade she is learning does not have an official name. It is simply called being a woman who knows how to keep a family clothed, which is not considered by the men who write economic reports to be a trade at all. The talk moves as the needles do, steady and unhurried, drifting from mending to news to the small careful gossip that keeps a neighbourhood informed of who needs help and who has some to spare. It is here, in this front room, more than almost anywhere else, that you learn which families are truly struggling this month and which are managing, which children need shoes before the weather turns, and whose father has, quietly, found a few days of work that might stretch into more. This information moves through the sewing circle days, sometimes weeks, before it would ever reach the men at the mill or the shopkeepers downtown, and it moves because women share a particular kind of trust with one another in rooms like this, a trust built stitch by stitch over years of exactly this sort of Thursday afternoon. The needle in your own hand pauses over a torn sleeve, and you find yourself thinking, not for the first time, about how much of what keeps this street functioning happens in rooms exactly like this one, unremarked, unpaid in any currency a bank would recognize, and utterly essential all the same. There is quiet pride, too, that moves through this circle, though it rarely announces itself outright. Each woman here has skills the others genuinely need, skills that would take real money to replace if this circle did not exist, and there is a dignity in being needed for a specific valuable thing that has nothing to do with whether your husband is currently employed. In this room, for a few hours every Thursday, you are not defined by his wages at all. You are defined by your own steady hand, your own patient eye, your own accumulated years of a craft the wider economy has simply forgotten to notice. The light through the front window shifts as the afternoon wears on, growing longer and more golden, and the pile of mending in each woman's lap slowly shrinks. Somewhere near 4 o'clock, Mrs. Hollis will finish the last of the coat hems and fold the garments neatly, ready to go home with their owners, repaired and strengthened for another winter of hard use. No money will change hands. No receipt will be written. And yet, a genuine transaction, several genuine transactions, will have taken place, precisely calibrated and precisely fair, understood completely by every woman in the room and by almost no one outside it. You wonder sometimes what a stranger passing by the window might make of this scene. 6 or 7 women bent over needlework, talking quietly, looking for all the world like they are simply passing a pleasant afternoon. A stranger would have no way of knowing that what they are watching is, in its own modest way, a fully functioning market, moving real value between real households, keeping real children clothed through a winter that has been very hard on nearly everyone on this street. There is a room at the top of the stairs that used to belong to nobody in particular. It held a broken sewing table, a trunk of out-of-season clothes, a general accumulation of things too good to throw away and too useless to keep in active use. 18 months ago, you cleared it out in a single determined afternoon, scrubbed the floor on your knees, hung a curtain over the small window, and moved a narrow bed in from the attic. Since then, it has held Mr. Averill, a quiet man of perhaps 50 who works, when there is work to be had, at the rail yard, and who pays you $4 a week for the room and 2 meals a day, delivered to a small table by the window, because he prefers, he says, to take his supper in peace. $4 does not sound like much, spoken aloud. It sounds smaller still when you consider what it costs you to earn it: an extra place set at every meal, extra laundry, extra mending, a whole extra person's worth of care folded invisibly into a day that was already full before he arrived. But $4 a week, week after week, adds up to more than your husband's wages increase by in an entire good year at the mill, and it arrives with a reliability his wages, cut and reduced and occasionally suspended entirely, have not managed to match these past 2 years. You are far from alone in this arrangement. Up and down this street, and in nearly every working-class neighborhood in the country during these hard years, spare rooms that would once have sat empty or been reserved for visiting relatives, filled instead with boarders, paying guests who were, in the plainest economic terms, a source of income that belonged almost entirely to the woman running the household, because it was her labor, her cooking, her laundering, her management of the household's daily rhythm that made the arrangement possible at all. Census records from these years show boarding and lodging as one of the most common informal occupations reported by women, and yet the word occupation undersells what the work actually involved. It was not a single task performed once and repeated. It was an entire second household folded invisibly inside the first, managed alongside everything else every single day without pause. Mr. Averill is by most measures an easy boarder. He is quiet, tidy, prompt with his rent, and grateful in a reserved, undemonstrative way for the meals set before him. Not every household on this street has been so fortunate. 2 doors down, Mrs. Petrosky took in a young man last spring who proved unreliable with his rent and inconsiderate with his hours, coming and going at all times of night, and she spent a difficult few months trying to decide whether the income was worth the disruption before, finally with evident relief, asking him to find lodging elsewhere. There is real risk in this economy, a genuine calculation of character and reliability that falls, as so much else does, entirely on the woman making the arrangement, because it is her home, her family's safety and comfort that a stranger under the roof puts at some small risk in exchange for badly needed cash. The work of housing a boarder is layered so thoroughly into your existing labor that it becomes, after the first few weeks, almost invisible even to you. An extra plate at breakfast, an extra set of sheets in the wash on Mondays, a slightly larger pot of stew simmering on the stove come supper time. None of it announces itself as separate labor, and yet all of it is labor, real hours added to days that had no particular surplus of hours to spare. You have simply absorbed it the way you have absorbed every other demand these hard years have placed on you, because the alternative, $4 fewer a week arriving into a household budget that is already stretched thin as old cloth, is not an alternative you are willing to consider. There is a strange intimacy, too, in sharing your home with someone who is neither family nor friend, but something adjacent to both, a person who sits at your table most evenings, who knows the particular sounds of your household's morning routine, who has become, almost without anyone deciding it should happen, a fixture in the rhythm of your days. Mr. Averill asks after your children by name. He notices and mentions when the bread is especially good. He is not family, but he is not entirely a stranger either, not anymore, and the boundary between the two, in a house that depends on his $4 a week, has grown pleasantly blurred. What strikes you most when you allow yourself to think about it directly is how completely this arrangement depends on skills the wider world does not consider skills at all. Cooking for one more person, managing a household budget that has grown slightly more complex, reading character well enough to know, within the first week, whether a boarder will be trustworthy and easy or difficult and best avoided in future arrangements. None of it appears on any resume, none of it would qualify, in any office downtown, as relevant experience for paid employment. And yet it is, in the truest sense, a genuine business you are running, a small hospitality enterprise operating out of your own home, generating real income through your own judgment and labor, invisible to every official measure of the economy and utterly essential to your family's survival within it. The room at the top of the stairs, which used to belong to nobody in particular, now belongs in the most practical sense to the entire household's continued solvency. You climb the stairs each evening to check that Mr. Averill's lamp has enough oil, that his water pitcher has been refilled, small courtesies that cost you almost nothing and that, in their quiet accumulation, keep a paying guest content and a family afloat through a winter that has been very hard on families with no second income at all. You find yourself wondering some evenings how many other rooms on this street, in this town, across this whole hard country, have been quietly transformed this same way, from storage space to survival strategy, by a woman with a scrub brush and a narrow bed and no other choice but to make it work. Before the sun has fully cleared the rooftops, the corner where Main Street meets the old feed store has already begun to fill. Tables appear, some of them no more than a plank laid across two sawhorses, and onto them go the week's accumulated surplus of a dozen households at once. Eggs, still faintly warm from the henhouse. Butter pressed into neat pound blocks and wrapped in waxed paper. Jars of preserves catching the early light like small stained glass windows. Loaves of bread, a few chickens dressed and ready for the pot, whatever each woman has managed to produce beyond what her own family needs. This is the curb market, and it did not exist, not in this organized a form, before the hard years arrived. Agricultural extension agents working through county offices across the country had begun in the early years of the Depression to formally organize what farm and town women had always done informally, selling their surplus, and turned it into something closer to a regular institution, complete with assigned spaces, agreed prices, and a rotating schedule that let every woman in the county know exactly which Tuesday and Saturday were hers to claim a table. What had once been a scattered, apologetic sort of selling, a woman knocking on a neighbor's door with a basket of extra eggs, became instead a recognized, semi-official marketplace, and the difference in what it earned the women who sold there was not small. You arrive most Tuesdays with a basket over each arm, one holding eggs, the other holding whatever preserves or baked goods the week has yielded. The walk to Main Street takes the better part of 20 minutes, longer if the roads are muddy, and you have learned to time it precisely, arriving early enough to claim a good table position but not so early that you stand shivering in the cold for an hour before the first customers appear. There is a whole unspoken etiquette to the market, learned the way most things are learned in this economy, through observation and correction rather than any formal instruction. You do not undercut another woman's prices too aggressively. You do not let your eggs sit unsold and wilting past their freshness while hers move briskly, not without adjusting your own approach the following week. You learn, through trial and the occasional quiet word from a more experienced neighbor, exactly how this small, improvised economy expects you to behave. The money that changes hands at this corner, dime by dime and quarter by quarter, is genuinely yours in a way few other sources of income in this household are. Your husband's wages, however hard-earned, belong in some unspoken sense to the household as a whole, subject to his opinion on how they ought to be spent. The curb market money belongs to you alone, earned through your own hens, your own garden, your own hours of labor that no one else in the family performed or could easily replicate. What you do with it is, within the bounds of basic household necessity, your own decision, and that fact alone makes it feel different in your hand than any other dollar that passes through this house. Some weeks the market is generous. The eggs sell quickly, the preserves move well, and you walk home with your baskets empty and your apron pocket pleasantly heavy, already turning over in your mind the small specific things this money might buy. A length of fabric for a new dress, a book for the older boy who has read every book in the house twice over. Other weeks are leaner, the market crowded with too many women selling the same eggs, the same butter, prices dropping as everyone competes for the same small pool of buyers, and you walk home having earned barely enough to justify the morning's effort. The market, like every part of this economy, is unpredictable, dependent on weather and season and the general fortunes of everyone else selling beside you, and you have learned to hold your expectations loosely, grateful for a good week and unsurprised by a poor one. What the curb market represents, beyond the modest sums it generates, is something closer to legitimacy, a formally sanctioned space where women's economic activity is not merely tolerated, but actively organized and supported by county officials who had, in the depths of the Depression, come to understand what women in these communities had known all along, that the household economy and the wider economy were never truly separate things, and that a farm or town family's survival often depended as much on what the wife could produce and sell as on what the husband could earn through formal employment. It was, in its quiet way, one of the only pieces of the era's economic response that acknowledged, even if only implicitly, the real scale of women's economic contribution. You set your empty baskets down inside the back door, the morning's transactions already tucked away, and turn your attention to the rest of the day's waiting work. The curb market money will be folded into the second tin behind the flour, joining whatever else the week has brought in, another small, steady contribution to a household economy that runs, more than anyone downtown would ever guess, on the accumulated Tuesdays and Saturdays of women exactly like you. There is something to be said for the particular satisfaction of watching a stranger hand over real coin for something your own two hands produced, a satisfaction that has nothing to do with the modest sum involved and everything to do with the simple, undeniable fact of your own capability, proven again one market morning at a time. Once a week, a delivery boy from the shirtwaist factory downtown leaves a bundle at your back door, a stack of pre-cut fabric pieces, collars and cuffs and half-finished sleeves, along with a slip of paper listing exactly how many completed garments are expected back by the same day next week. This is piecework, an arrangement older than the factory system itself, in which the actual sewing, the labor that turns cut cloth into a wearable shirt, is farmed out to women working in their own homes, paid not by the hour, but by the finished piece, a few cents for each completed garment, the rate set by the factory and rarely open to negotiation. It is not romantic work, whatever a certain kind of story might make of a woman bent over her sewing machine by lamplight. It is exacting, repetitive, poorly compensated labor, and the factory's inspectors are not gentle with a garment that does not meet their standard. A shirt with a crooked collar or an uneven hem is returned unpaid, the hours that went into it entirely wasted, a fact that keeps you working with a level of concentrated care that leaves your shoulders aching by the end of an evening session at the machine. And yet, cent by cent, garment by garment, the work adds a real and reliable trickle of income to a household that needs every trickle it can find. This putting out system, as it is sometimes called, flourished during these hard years precisely because it cost the factories almost nothing beyond the piece rate itself. No wages for idle hours, no factory floor space to heat and light, no benefits or protections of any kind, simply a bundle of fabric delivered to a woman's own kitchen table and a finished garment collected a week later. For the factory, it was efficient. For the women performing the labor, it was a source of income available precisely because it required no travel, no time away from the dozen other demands already filling their days, work that could be picked up between other chores and set down again the moment a child cried or a pot boiled over. The sewing machine itself, a heavy black Singer that your mother passed down to you on your wedding day, sits by the window where the light is best, and you have come to know its particular rhythms the way you know the rhythms of every other tool in this house. The treadle beneath your foot, the steady clack of the needle, the small satisfaction of a seam sewn true and straight on the first pass. Some evenings, after the supper dishes are done and the children are settled, you sit at this machine for 2 or 3 hours by lamplight, the house quiet around you, and lose yourself in the steady, repetitive motion of it, your mind drifting even as your hands stay busy, the way it does during any long, familiar labor. The pay, when it comes, is modest almost to the point of insult. A few dollars for a week's worth of evening labor stacked atop every other demand on your time. And yet those few dollars, arriving with a regularity your husband's own wages have not always managed these past 2 years, have become a quietly essential part of the household's survival, one more thread in a financial safety net woven almost entirely from work the wider economy considers too small, too domestic, too easily dismissed to properly count. You have heard, through the same network of women who share everything from recipes to rumors, that some factories downtown have begun cutting their piece rates even further, squeezing an already thin margin thinner still, betting correctly that desperate women with few other options will keep sewing anyway because a few cents a garment is still more than no cents at all. There is a particular kind of quiet anger in this knowledge, a recognition that the very desperation that makes this work necessary is also what makes it possible for the factory to pay so little for it, and yet there is no obvious remedy available to a woman sewing shirtwaists alone in her own kitchen, with no union representative and no collective voice, only her own steady hands and her own stubborn need to keep the second tin filled. Still, the bundle arrives each week, and each week you sit down at the machine and begin again, collar after collar, cuff after cuff, the pile of finished garments growing slowly by lamplight until it is ready to be wrapped and sent back downtown, another small, unglamorous contribution to a household economy that has learned, out of pure necessity, to draw income from every possible hour of every possible day. You wonder, sometimes, watching the needle move steadily beneath your hands, how many other kitchens across this town are lit by the same late lamp, filled with the same steady clack of treadle and needle, women sewing quietly toward the same modest, essential goal. There is a particular knock reserved for emergencies, 3 quick raps followed by a pause and then one more, and you have come to recognize it in your sleep, the way a mother recognizes her own child's cry among a dozen others. Tonight, it comes just past midnight, and you are dressed and at the door before the sound has fully finished, because you know without being told what it means. Somewhere on this street or the next, a baby is coming, and Mrs. Reyes, who has attended more births in this neighborhood than any doctor downtown has ever seen, needs an extra pair of steady hands. You are not a trained midwife yourself, not in any formal sense, but you have assisted often enough now, boiling water and preparing linens and holding a frightened young mother's hand through the worst of it, that you have become something like an apprentice in a trade with no schoolhouse and no diploma. This too is part of the economy that exists alongside the official one. Doctors in town charge fees that many families simply cannot afford, particularly for something as routine in the eyes of the medical establishment as a healthy birth, and so the actual work of bringing children into the world in this neighborhood falls, more often than not, to women like Mrs. Reyes, paid in whatever combination of cash and goods a struggling family can manage, a few dollars if they have them, a dozen jars of preserves, and a promise of future help if they do not. The knowledge required for this work is formidable, though it would never be described that way by anyone holding a medical degree. Mrs. Reyes can read the progress of a labor with an accuracy that would surprise the doctors downtown, can recognize the early signs of trouble long before they become emergencies, can turn a poorly positioned infant with hands that have learned their skill through decades of direct experience rather than any textbook. She has delivered, by her own count, well over 300 babies in this neighborhood alone, and in all that time has lost only a handful, a record that compares favorably with the hospital across town, though no one downtown would ever think to compare the two. Tonight's birth is difficult, stretching past 2 in the morning and then past 3, the young mother exhausted and frightened, her own mother pacing the small front room with a rosary clutched in her hands. You do what you have learned to do in these situations. Keep the water hot, keep your voice low and steady, keep your own fear, when it rises, entirely off your face, because a frightened attendant is the last thing a laboring woman needs in the room with her. Mrs. Reyes works with a calm that seems to your still inexperienced eye almost supernatural. her hands sure even as the hours stretch on, murmuring encouragement in a voice pitched exactly right to soothe without patronizing. When the child finally arrives, well past 4 in the morning, small and furious and entirely healthy, the relief in the room is a physical thing, a collective exhale that seems to loosen every tense shoulder at once. Mrs. Reyes will stay another hour yet, making certain mother and child are both settled and well before finally accepting a cup of coffee and a few dollars pressed quietly into her palm by the new grandmother, payment for a night's work that no insurance company would recognize and no medical license technically authorizes, and that has, all the same, brought a healthy child safely into the world at a fraction of what the hospital downtown would have charged for the same service, delivered with no less skill and considerably more personal care. You walk home as the sky is just beginning to lighten, exhausted in the particular way that comes from a long night spent in service of someone else's crisis, and you find yourself thinking about the strange, unofficial infrastructure that women like Mrs. Reyes represent. An entire informal medical system running quietly alongside the official one, staffed by women whose expertise the wider world has no framework for recognizing, compensated through a currency of cash, goods, and mutual obligation that will never appear in any hospital's annual report. This work, you understand now with the particular clarity that comes from exhaustion, has always mattered more than the men who run the hospitals downtown are inclined to admit. It is women like Mrs. Reyes, moving quietly from house to house through the darkest hours of the night, who have kept whole neighborhoods of struggling families from choosing between a doctor's bill they cannot pay and a birth attended by no one qualified at all. There is no ledger anywhere that records the true value of what she does. There is only the growing number of children in this neighborhood who arrived safely into the world because she was willing to answer a knock at the door at any hour for whatever a family could manage to give her. You may find yourself wondering how many other quiet, unlicensed experts like Mrs. Reyes are moving through the dark streets of towns across this whole country tonight, answering the same kind of knock, asking for the same modest payment, saving lives that history will never think to credit them for. Nothing in this house dies twice. That is not quite the right way to put it, and yet it is the phrase that comes closest to describing the particular discipline you have developed these past few years. A discipline in which nothing is thrown away until every last possible use has been wrung out of it, and even then, what looks to an outside eye like final waste is very often not waste at all, but simply the raw material for someone else's small trade. The bacon grease poured off after breakfast into a can kept specifically for the purpose will not go to the rubbish heap. Some of it becomes the base for tonight's biscuits, but the rest, accumulated over weeks, will go into soap, rendered down with lye and a careful, patient process your own mother taught you, producing bars of harsh but perfectly serviceable soap that save the household a real expense at the store downtown. What you cannot use yourself you trade, a portion of rendered fat exchanged with a neighbor for something she has and you need, another small transaction in the endless quiet barter that runs beneath the surface of this street. Rags too have a second life waiting for them. Worn shirts and outgrown dresses, patched and repatched until patching is no longer possible, are cut down into cleaning cloths, quilt scraps, and, when a bundle grows large enough, sold outright to the rag man who makes his rounds through the neighborhood every few weeks, his cart creaking under a growing mountain of other households' cast-offs. He pays by the pound, a small sum, but a real one, and the rag trade during these hard years grew into something close to a formal industry, feeding paper mills and mattress-stuffing manufacturers who had discovered that a country determined to waste nothing could supply raw material more cheaply than any virgin source. Bones from the Sunday roast, once picked clean for soup stock, do not go to waste either, sold or traded to the same rag and bone man, destined for glue factories and fertilizer plants that had learned, out of the same hard necessity gripping every household in the country, to extract value from what a more comfortable era would have discarded without a second thought. There is something almost satisfying in this final accounting, watching a chicken carcass move from Sunday dinner to Monday soup stock to Tuesday's small trade with the bone man, every last piece of it converted into either nourishment or income before it finally leaves the house for good. You have become, without ever choosing the title, something close to a small manufacturer, converting the household's waste stream into a modest but genuine source of both savings and income. The habits that make this possible are not glamorous. They require a kind of constant, low-grade attention to every material object that passes through the house. a mental accounting of what might still be useful and to whom, a discipline that a more comfortable household in an easier year would never think to develop. And yet this discipline, practiced by women across the entire country during these hard years, quietly reduced household waste and generated a genuine flow of secondary income at a scale that no official economic survey ever thought to measure. The ragman's cart creaks past the house every third Thursday, and you have learned to have your bundle ready, sorted and tied, waiting by the back door. The exchange takes only a few minutes, a quick weighing on his hanging scale, a few coins pressed into your palm, and he is on to the next house, the next bundle, the next small contribution to an economy of reclaimed material that stretches across the whole country like an invisible second industry, running entirely on the accumulated discipline of women who had learned out of pure necessity that nothing was truly finished being useful until it had been used every possible way it could be. There is a quiet philosophy folded into all of this, one you have never articulated aloud, but that shapes nearly every decision you make about the physical objects passing through your household. Waste, in this economy, is not merely wasteful. It is a kind of failure, a small defeat that a more careful woman would have avoided, and so you do not waste as a matter of both necessity and a hard-won pride in your own resourcefulness, converting what a wealthier decade would have simply discarded into soap, into rags, into a few coins from the bone man scale, into one more thread woven into the second tin behind the flour. You find yourself wondering, watching the ragman's cart disappear around the corner, just how much of this entire country's Depression-era survival was quietly built on exactly this kind of patient, unglamorous conversion, a whole hidden industry of reclaimed value that no one downtown ever thought important enough to write down. The grocer keeps a book beneath his counter, a plain ledger with a marbled cover, and inside it, in his own careful hand, is recorded exactly what every family on this street owes him and exactly what they have paid toward that debt in the past month. Yours is one of perhaps 40 accounts in that book, and the balance in it rises and falls with the same rhythm as the second tin behind your flour, growing in lean weeks, shrinking in better ones, never quite reaching zero and never so far growing large enough to worry him into refusing you further credit. This system of running accounts, extended almost universally by small grocers and shopkeepers to families they had known for years, kept an enormous number of households fed through weeks when the cash simply was not there. It was not charity, not exactly, though it required a genuine trust on the grocer's part that few banks downtown were willing to extend to families in your position. It was instead a recognition born of long acquaintance and careful observation, of which families could be relied upon to pay what they owed eventually, even if eventually stretched out over several difficult months, and which families sadly could not. You have learned to manage this account the way you manage everything else in this household, with a careful, ongoing calculation of what can be deferred and what must be paid now. When the curb market brings in a good week, some of that money goes directly to the grocer, chipping away at the running balance before it can grow uncomfortably large. When the week is lean, the account grows a little instead, a small mercy that lets the children eat even when the tin behind the flour is nearly bare. The grocer never comments on this rhythm, never asks pointed questions about why one week brings payment and another does not. He simply records the numbers in his marbled book and trusts, as he has trusted for years, that the balance will eventually come right. Some towns, when the banks failed outright and left almost no cash circulating at all, went further still and began issuing their own local scrip, a kind of emergency currency backed not by gold or federal guarantee, but simply by the collective agreement of local merchants to honor it as though it were real money. Your own town never quite reached that extremity, though you have heard through the same network of women who share every piece of news worth knowing that a town 2 counties over kept its local economy functioning for the better part of a year on nothing but script printed by the mayor's own office, backed by nothing more than everyone's shared determination not to let their community simply stop functioning for lack of official currency. What strikes you, turning this over in your mind, is how much of the Depression's true survival strategy rested not on anything printed in Washington, but on precisely this kind of local, personal trust, extended between people who had known each other long enough to make a fair judgment about character, backed by nothing more substantial than a shared stake in the neighborhood's continued survival. The grocer's marbled book is, in its own modest way, every bit as much a financial institution as the bank downtown, perhaps more genuinely useful to families like yours because it extends credit based on years of direct observation rather than any formal application, and because it has never once, in all the years you have known him, failed a family in true need. There is a particular kind of dignity, too, in being trusted this way, in having a grocer who knows you well enough to extend credit without demanding collateral or paperwork, simply because he has watched you pay, faithfully, however slowly, every debt you have ever carried in his book. That trust was not given freely. It was built over years of exactly this kind of careful, patient repayment. And it represents, in its way, one more form of currency this hidden economy runs on. A currency of reputation and reliability that took years to accumulate and that once damaged would be almost impossible to rebuild. You pass the grocer's window most mornings on your way to or from the curb market, and you glance in, out of habit more than anything, checking whether he is busy or free, whether today might be a good day to settle a little more of the running balance. The marbled book sits somewhere beneath his counter, invisible to most of his customers, holding within its pages an entire quiet history of how this street survived years that the official economy had, by nearly every public measure, declared a catastrophe. It occurs to you, walking home past his window, that trust of this particular kind, patient and personal and utterly without paperwork, may have kept more families fed during these hard years than any single government program designed with far greater fanfare and far less understanding of how a struggling household actually manages to get by. Word travels through this neighborhood in a way that has nothing to do with the newspaper, though it moves nearly as fast and considerably more accurately. It travels through backyard fences and church basements, through the sewing circle on Thursdays and the curb market on Tuesdays and Saturdays, through 100 small, unremarkable conversations between women who have learned, out of long practice, exactly which pieces of information are worth passing along and exactly who most needs to hear them. This is the Whisper Network, and though the name makes it sound like idle gossip, what actually moves through it is often the single most valuable resource available to a family in genuine trouble. It was Mrs. Kowalski, 3 houses down, who first heard that the shirt factory downtown was quietly hiring again after a long stretch of layoffs, and who passed the word to you within the hour, giving your own husband a full day's head start on the dozens of other men who would eventually hear the same news through slower, more official channels. It was you, in turn, who heard from a cousin visiting from the next county over that a new relief office had opened offering assistance that many families on this street qualified for but had no idea existed, and who spent the better part of an afternoon walking door to door, sharing the address and the hours, because the office itself had done almost nothing to advertise its own presence. The relief programs that emerged during these years, sprawling and unevenly administered, depended enormously on exactly this kind of informal information sharing to reach the families who actually needed them. Official announcements, when they came at all, were often buried in newspaper columns that a working family had little time to read closely, or posted on notice boards in parts of town that women managing a household rarely had occasion to visit. It was the Whisper Network, the accumulated, patient work of women passing information hand to hand across kitchen tables and clotheslines, that actually closed the gap between a program's existence on paper and a struggling family's awareness that help might be available to them at all. There is a particular skill involved in this work that goes well beyond simply hearing news and repeating it. You have learned over these hard years to weigh information carefully before passing it along, distinguishing reliable reports from wishful rumor, understanding which pieces of news are worth the risk of raising a struggling family's hopes, and which are better verified further before being shared. A false rumor about available work passed carelessly through the network could send a desperate man walking 3 miles to a factory gate that was not, in fact, hiring, a waste of effort and hope that this community can ill afford. And so the women who move information through this network have developed, without ever formally discussing it, a shared standard of care, a habit of checking sources and hedging uncertain claims that would not embarrass a professional journalist. The network extends, too, into matters far more delicate than job openings and relief offices. It is through this same quiet channel that you learned, well before any one official said a word, that the Hendersons 2 streets over were on the verge of losing their home to the bank. information that let a handful of neighboring families quietly organize a modest collection to help cover the Hendersons' overdue payment before the situation became a public humiliation for a family too proud to ask for help directly. It is through this network that word spreads when a landlord on the next block has shown himself willing to accept partial rent and wait patiently for the rest. Information that has, more than once, kept a struggling family from eviction simply because someone thought to mention, in passing, over a fence or a mending basket, that Mr. Corrigan was known to be reasonable about timing if you approached him honestly and explained your situation. There is a formal name that a later generation of scholars would eventually give to this kind of informal, trust-based information exchange, describing it as a form of social capital every bit as real and every bit as valuable to a struggling community as any amount of cash sitting in a bank account. At the time, none of the women moving this information through backyard fences and church basements would have used any such term. They would simply have called it looking out for one another, a phrase that undersells just slightly the genuine sophistication of the system they had built, entirely without formal organization, entirely without anyone in a position of official authority ever recognizing its existence or its importance. You think sometimes, standing at the fence exchanging the week's news with Mrs. Kowalski, about how differently this whole hard decade might have gone for families on this street without this quiet, constant flow of information moving between them. The men downtown, deciding which programs to fund and which offices to open, rarely, if ever, considered how the news of their decisions would actually reach the families most in need of them. It fell, as so much else in this shadow economy has fallen, to women like you and Mrs. Kowalski and a dozen others up and down this street, passing word carefully and accurately from kitchen to kitchen, making certain that no family on this block suffered simply for lack of knowing what help might be available to them. The fence between your yard and Mrs. Kowalski's has become, in its own unassuming way, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure this neighborhood possesses, more reliable in many respects than the official channels it so often outpaces. You may find yourself wondering how many other fences, in how many other neighborhoods across this country, are serving exactly this same quiet, essential purpose tonight, carrying word from one struggling household to the next, asking nothing in return but the same courtesy passed along in turn. If you have been drifting along with the story so far, this is a good place to let yourself sink a little further. There is quite a bit of history still to come, but none of it needs to be chased. It will still be here whether you are fully awake for it or not, and this show, along with the whole library behind it, is sitting there on Spotify too, waiting for the nights when even a screen feels like too much. Links in the description and pinned in the comments whenever you want it. Twice a week you walk the 11 blocks to the old warehouse on Elm Street that the Relief Administration converted, a little over a year ago now, into what everyone in town simply calls the sewing room. Inside, rows of donated machines fill what used to be storage space for a hardware distributor, and at each one sits a woman, some as young as 18, some well past 60, all of them there for the same reason. This is one of the Relief Works programs that actually put women to work rather than simply distributing aid, and it pays a modest wage paid in actual government cash for garments sewn to be distributed to families across the county who cannot afford to clothe themselves at all. This detail surprises people later when they hear about it. The large public works programs of these years are remembered almost entirely for the roads and bridges and post offices they built, monuments that still stand decades on, credited to the men who dug and hammered and poured concrete. Far less remembered, though scarcely less significant at the time, are the sewing rooms, the canning centers, the household worker training programs that employed hundreds of thousands of women across the country during these same years, producing garments and preserved food and domestic skills that kept an enormous number of struggling families clothed and fed, work that has left no bridge standing anywhere to remind a later generation that it happened at all. The pay is not generous, a modest hourly wage set well below what a man on a road crew might earn for comparable hours, a disparity that the women in this room discuss occasionally in low voices with a mixture of resignation and quiet anger that rarely finds any outlet beyond the conversation itself. But it is real money, government money, earned through honest, skilled labor. And for a great many women in this room, women whose husbands are unemployed or earning too little to support the family alone, it represents something close to a lifeline, a source of income entirely independent of anything a husband does or does not bring home. There is a particular atmosphere in this room that differs, in ways you have noticed without quite being able to name, from the sewing circle that gathers in your own front room on Thursdays. That circle is friendly, informal, built on years of neighborly trust. This room is something closer to an actual workplace, with a supervisor who checks each finished garment against a quality standard, a quota each woman is expected to meet, a formal structure that makes the work feel in a way the barter economy never quite does, like genuine employment. Several of the women here have said, quietly, that this is the first time in their lives they have held anything resembling an actual paying job, a fact that carries a complicated weight, part pride at finally being formally, officially employed, part quiet grief at what it took, an entire national catastrophe to make that employment possible. The garments produced here, plain but sturdy dresses and shirts and children's clothing, are distributed through relief offices to families across the county who have nothing else to clothe themselves with, and there is real satisfaction, sitting at your machine through a long afternoon, in knowing precisely where your labor is going and precisely whom it will help. This is different, too, from the anonymous piecework you do at home for the shirtwaist factory, garments that vanish into a commercial supply chain you will never see the end of. Here, you know, with real specificity, that the dress taking shape beneath your hands will go to a family very much like your own, struggling through the same hard year, grateful for a warm, well-made garment they could not otherwise afford. The women in this room talk while they work, the same steady undercurrent of conversation that runs through every gathering of working women you have ever been part of, and the talk here carries a particular flavor, a shared awareness that everyone present has been formally recognized by the government itself as a worker whose labor is worth an actual wage. It is a small thing, perhaps, set against the scale of the whole country's troubles, and yet it matters enormously to the women sitting in this converted warehouse, stitching garments through the long afternoon, because it represents for many of them the first official acknowledgement they have ever received that their skilled labor has genuine economic value, worth paying for in the same currency a man's labor is paid in. You walk home each evening from Elm Street with a small government paycheck folded into your coat pocket, distinct in feel and meaning from every other dollar you earn through the quieter, unofficial channels of the neighborhood economy. This money has your name on it, issued by an actual government office, evidence that at least one small corner of the vast official response to this catastrophe finally noticed that women too needed and deserved paid work, and that the skills women had always possessed, sewing chief among them, were exactly the skills this crisis most urgently required. There is something to be said for the particular quiet the walk home carries most evenings. 11 blocks of settling dusk, your feet tired, your government wage folded safely away, and the accumulated satisfaction of a day's honest, recognized labor sitting comfortably in your chest the whole way. The church basement smells, every Wednesday evening, of onions and simmering broth long before you reach the bottom of the stairs, a smell that has come to mean something specific and reassuring to nearly everyone in this part of town. This is the Ladies' Aid Kitchen, organized and run entirely by the women of the congregation, and on any given Wednesday it feeds anywhere from 30 to 80 people, families who have fallen on genuinely desperate times, men between jobs with nowhere else to turn, elderly widows whose small savings have long since run dry. The pot itself is enormous, a cast-iron vessel that must hold 10 gallons at least, donated years ago by a butcher who has since passed on, and it simmers all afternoon on the basement's ancient stove, filled with whatever the week's collected donations have provided. Vegetables past their prime but still perfectly good, donated by grocers who would otherwise have thrown them out. A soup bone or two from the butcher's current owner, who has continued his predecessor's quiet generosity toward the Wednesday pot. Whatever surplus the congregation's own gardens have produced, brought in by the same women who spend their Tuesdays and Saturdays selling their surplus at the curb market, a portion of every harvest set aside specifically for this purpose. Organizing this operation, week after week, is itself a formidable piece of unpaid labor, though no one involved would ever describe it in those terms. Someone must coordinate the donations, tracking which families have offered what, and following up gently when a promised contribution has not yet arrived. Someone must plan the week's menu around whatever ingredients have actually materialized, adjusting on the fly when a promised delivery of potatoes fails to appear. Someone must manage the serving line itself, making certain that everyone who comes through the basement door leaves with a full bowl, while also quietly, discreetly identifying which families might need a little something extra sent home with them, a loaf of bread or a jar of preserves tucked unobtrusively into a worn coat pocket, given in a way that preserves the recipient's dignity rather than announcing their need to the whole room. This last skill, the quiet art of giving help without humiliating the person receiving it, is perhaps the most sophisticated piece of unpaid labor performed in this basement each week, and it is a skill the women running this kitchen have refined through years of careful practice. A family that has never before needed charity carries a particular kind of pride into a room like this one, a pride that could easily curdle into shame if the help offered is not extended with genuine tact. You have watched Mrs. Abernathy, who has run this kitchen longer than anyone else currently involved, manage this exact challenge dozens of times, greeting a newly struggling family with the same warm, unremarkable welcome she extends to everyone, making certain that accepting a bowl of soup from this pot never feels like an admission of failure, but simply like what neighbors do for one another in a hard year. The economics of this operation, though no one involved would ever use so cold a word to describe it, are genuinely significant when added up across a whole community. Dozens of families, week after week through the worst of these hard years, have been kept from genuine hunger by exactly this kind of organized, women-run mutual aid, functioning entirely outside any government program, funded through nothing more formal than a collection plate and the accumulated generosity of a congregation that has itself very little to spare. Fraternal societies and immigrant mutual aid associations across the country ran similar operations during these same years. Entire informal welfare systems built and staffed almost exclusively by women, feeding and supporting communities that the official relief apparatus, chronically underfunded and slow to reach every corner of every town, could not adequately serve on its own. You take your turn at the serving line tonight, ladling soup into bowls held out by familiar faces and a handful of new ones, families you have not seen here before, evidence that the hard year continues to claim new victims even as the old ones slowly, unevenly begin to recover. There is no glory in this work, no public recognition beyond the quiet gratitude of the people you feed, and yet you understand, standing over the enormous simmering pot with a ladle in your hand, that what happens in this basement every Wednesday evening represents one of the most genuinely essential pieces of infrastructure this whole struggling community possesses. The pot will need refilling again before the evening is through, and you set about the task without being asked, because that is simply how this kitchen runs, each woman doing whatever needs doing without waiting for instruction, an entire operation held together by nothing more than shared purpose and years of practiced cooperation. You wonder, ladling the last of tonight's broth into a final waiting bowl, how many church basements and lodge halls across this whole country are simmering with exactly this same quiet, unpaid, essential labor tonight, keeping whole neighborhoods fed through a catastrophe that history will remember mostly for its breadlines and its unemployed men, and only rarely for the women who kept the actual pot simmering. Not every household on this street does its own laundry anymore, not entirely. A handful of the better-off families nearby, those where the husband has managed to keep steady work through these hard years, have taken to sending their washing out, and Mrs. Yoder, 3 doors down, has built what amounts to a small, quietly thriving laundry business out of her own back kitchen, taking in bundles of other people's dirty clothes twice a week in exchange for a set fee per load, considerably less than a commercial laundry downtown would charge, and considerably more valuable to her own struggling household than the equivalent hours spent on any other task available to her. This work is, by any honest measure, brutal. Laundry for one's own family is hard enough. The endless hauling and heating of water, the punishing scrub of a washboard against stubborn stains, the long hours bent over a steaming tub in a kitchen that grows unbearably close and damp by mid-morning. Laundry for 2 or 3 additional families, taken on top of her own household's normal wash, stretches Mrs. Yoder's days to a length that would exhaust a far younger woman, and she is not by any means young. And yet she has chosen this particular trade deliberately out of all the informal work available to a woman in her position, because it draws on a skill she has spent 40 years perfecting, and because, unlike piecework or curb market selling, it produces a steady, predictable income that does not depend on the whims of a factory's order book or the unpredictable generosity of Tuesday's market crowd. The economics of her small business are precise, worked out through long trial and adjustment. She charges by the bundle rather than by the piece, having learned early that piece pricing invited customers to underestimate, whether through carelessness or deliberate economy, exactly how much laundry they were actually sending her way. She has settled on a rotation, certain families on Monday and Thursday, others on Tuesday and Friday, that lets her manage the physical demands of the work without any single day overwhelming her entirely. She has learned, too, which stains respond to which particular home remedy, a paste of this ground into a solution of that. Knowledge passed down through generations of women exactly like her and refined in her own case through decades of direct hands-on experimentation. What she has built, without ever using the word herself, is a genuine small enterprise, complete with regular customers, a pricing structure, a production schedule, and a hard-won reputation for quality that keeps those customers returning rather than taking their business to one of the handful of other women on nearby streets who have built similar operations of their own. She competes, in her quiet way, with those other women, aware of what they charge and careful to offer something, whether a slightly lower price or a slightly higher standard of finished pressing, that keeps her own bundles of washing arriving reliably twice a week. You bring your own linens to her on occasion, not the family's everyday washing, which you continue to do yourself as a matter of both economy and habit, but the good tablecloth and the special linens reserved for holidays and visiting relatives, items delicate enough that you would rather trust Mrs. Yoda's practiced hand than risk your own more hurried effort. The few coins this costs you feel entirely worth it, both for the genuinely superior result and for the simple pleasure of supporting a neighbor's hard-won enterprise, one woman's business sustaining another's household in a small, quiet cycle of mutual support that runs invisibly beneath the surface of this whole struggling street. Mrs. Yoda's hands, when you see them, tell their own story, roughened and reddened well past what even the ordinary demands of housework would produce, the visible cost of a trade she has chosen deliberately and pursued with real skill despite what it takes from her physically. She does not complain of this, at least not where anyone can hear her, though you have noticed on the coldest winter mornings a particular stiffness in the way she moves her fingers before the day's first bundle forces them back into motion. There is a dignity in her chosen trade that goes beyond the modest income it provides, a dignity rooted in genuine mastery, in the fact that families across this part of town have come to specifically seek out her particular skill, her particular reliability, rather than simply taking their business to whichever woman happens to have room in her schedule. She has built, out of nothing but her own 2 hands and 40 years of accumulated expertise, something that functions very much like a small, respected business, invisible to any chamber of commerce, and yet entirely real to every family whose washing passes through her steaming back kitchen twice a week. You may find yourself wondering, watching Mrs. Yoda haul yet another bundle of someone else's washing through her back door, just how many small, unofficial businesses exactly like hers are quietly operating on streets across this whole country tonight, built entirely on skill and reputation and the patient accumulation of trust, invisible to every official record and utterly indispensable to the families who depend on them. Once a month, a small leather case makes its way through the neighborhood, carried from door to door by a woman named Ruth, who has, over the past year, built herself a modest but genuine livelihood, selling face powders, hair tonics, and small household notions directly out of that case, one careful doorstep conversation at a time. This kind of direct selling, a woman carrying a company's goods from home to home rather than waiting behind a store counter for customers to arrive, grew substantially during these hard years, offering a rare category of income opportunity that required almost no capital to begin, only the case itself, a small starting inventory purchased on credit from the company she represents, and a genuine willingness to knock on doors and make a case, quite literally, for whatever she is carrying that week. Ruth is good at this work in a way that surprised even her by her own admission when she first began. She has a memory for exactly which household prefers lavender to rose, which family has a daughter recently engaged and might welcome a suggestion of something special for the occasion, which homes are worth a longer visit and quiet cup of coffee, and which are best approached briskly. Business concluded and door closed within a few efficient minutes. This is, in its own right, a genuine sales skill, refined through the same patient trial and error that governs every other trade in this hidden economy, and it earns her a commission on every item sold, a percentage that, added up across a full month of steady door-to-door effort, provides her family with an income her husband's own irregular work has not always managed to match. The relationship between Ruth and her customers runs deeper than a simple transaction, in the same way that nearly every economic exchange in this neighborhood carries some social weight beyond its stated price. She has become, over her rounds, something close to a confidant for several of the women on her route, privy to small confidences shared over the kitchen table while she demonstrates a new face cream or discusses which shade of powder best suits a particular complexion. This intimacy is not incidental to her business. It is in a real sense the foundation of it, because a woman is far more likely to make a purchase, even a modest one, from someone she has come to trust and genuinely like than from an anonymous store clerk she sees once and never again. You have bought from Ruth's case yourself on several occasions a small tin of face powder that felt, in a year otherwise defined by careful denial of every possible small pleasure, like a genuinely worthwhile indulgence, and a bottle of hair tonic that she assured you, correctly as it turned out, would help tame the particular unruliness your hair develops in the damp months. The purchases are modest, a few cents here and there, and yet they represent a real and welcome addition to Ruth's own household income, built one careful doorstep conversation at a time, month after month, across dozens of homes on her regular route. What Ruth has built, without any formal business training and without a single dollar of outside investment beyond the small credit extended by the company whose products fill her case, is a genuine sales territory, cultivated relationships, and a repeat customer base that any downtown shop owner would recognize as the fundamentals of a real business. She keeps her own informal records, a small notebook noting which households buy which products and roughly how often, allowing her to anticipate needs before a customer even mentions them, arriving with exactly the right item at exactly the right moment, a level of personalized service no downtown store could hope to replicate. There is, too, a particular kind of freedom in Ruth's work that distinguishes it from nearly every other trade practiced by the women in this neighborhood. She sets her own hours, chooses her own route, and answers to no factory supervisor checking her stitches against a quality standard. The income is entirely dependent on her own effort and skill, a genuine meritocracy of sorts, rewarding precisely the qualities warmth, memory, patient attentiveness that the wider economy has never thought to properly value or compensate. You watch her leather case disappear around the corner at the end of the street, already anticipating her next round in a few weeks' time, and you find yourself thinking about how many women across this whole country have built, out of nothing more than a small case of goods and a genuine gift for conversation, entire livelihoods that the official economic statistics of this era will never once think to count. Entrepreneurs in every meaningful sense of the word, operating without a single one of the formal trappings the word usually implies. Once a month, on the second Thursday, a smaller and more solemn gathering meets in the same church basement that hosts the Wednesday soup pot, though the mood in the room is entirely different, businesslike in a way the soup kitchen never quite is. This is the meeting of the Ladies' Mutual Benefit Society, an organization that has existed in this congregation for close to 30 years now, and that has become, during these particularly hard years, more essential to its members than perhaps at any point since its founding. The society functions, in the simplest possible terms, as a kind of informal insurance, entirely organized and administered by women, entirely outside any formal insurance company's involvement. Each member contributes a small sum, a dime or a quarter depending on what the month allows, into a shared fund managed by an elected treasurer, one of the founding members, now well into her 70s, whose meticulous record-keeping has earned the trust of every woman who has ever paid into the fund. In exchange, any member facing a genuine crisis, a sudden illness, a death in the family requiring funeral costs no household budget could otherwise absorb, can draw on the collective fund for support, a benefit paid out according to rules the membership itself established and revised over the years through careful collective discussion. These mutual aid societies, organized by women across ethnic and religious communities throughout the country during this era, represented one of the era's most sophisticated grassroots responses to the simple, terrifying fact that a single medical crisis or death in the family could bankrupt an already struggling household entirely. Commercial insurance, where it existed at all for families in your position, was often prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable, and formal government safety nets, still in their earliest and most limited form, rarely covered the specific, immediate costs a funeral or a sudden illness actually demanded. Into that gap stepped organizations exactly like this one, run by women who understood, from direct personal experience, precisely what kind of financial catastrophe a family could face and precisely what kind of collective protection might actually help. The meeting tonight opens, as it always does, with the Treasurer's careful report, a recitation of exactly how much sits in the collective fund, exactly which members have paid their monthly dues on time, and which, facing particular hardship, have been granted a temporary extension by unanimous vote of the membership. There is genuine democratic process at work in this small basement room, motions made and seconded, votes taken by show of hands, minutes recorded in a ledger nearly as thick as the grocer's own marbled book. It would look, to an outside observer stumbling upon the meeting, remarkably similar to any formal board meeting conducted downtown, except that every single person in the room is a woman, and the sums under discussion, however modest, represent genuine financial protection for dozens of families who have no other safety net to speak of. Tonight's business includes a request from Mrs. Delgado, whose husband passed unexpectedly 3 weeks ago, leaving her with young children and a funeral bill she could not possibly cover alone. The Society's rules entitle her to a benefit payment calculated according to her years of membership and monthly contributions, a formula worked out years ago through exactly this same kind of careful collective deliberation. And the vote to release the payment passes without discussion, a formality really, because every woman in this room understands precisely what Mrs. Delgado is facing, and precisely why the fund exists in the first place. This is not charity extended downward from those with more to those with less. It is insurance, paid into faithfully by every member over years, drawn upon exactly as intended in a moment of genuine need. What makes this system remarkable beyond its simple practical usefulness is the degree of financial sophistication it required from women who had, in most cases, no formal education in accounting or actuarial mathematics whatsoever. The Society's founders, 3 decades ago now, worked out contribution rates and benefit formulas through nothing more than careful observation and trial adjustment, refining the system over years until it reached a genuine, sustainable balance, enough coming in through monthly dues to cover the benefits paid out, with a careful reserve maintained against particularly hard years like this one. It is, in every functional sense, a small insurance company, built and run entirely by women with no formal training in the field, sustained through decades of careful collective financial management that any downtown insurance office would recognize as genuinely competent work. You pay your own monthly dues tonight, a quarter pressed into the treasurer's careful hand, and you feel, as you always do at these meetings, a particular kind of security that no single dollar in the tin behind your own flour could ever quite provide alone. This fund represents not just your own careful saving, but the pooled resources and pooled risk of 40 families across this congregation, a genuine collective protection against the kind of catastrophe that no single household, however carefully managed, could easily absorb on its own. The meeting closes, as it always does, with a brief moment of quiet reflection for any member facing particular hardship this month, Mrs. Delgado's name spoken gently among them. A small acknowledgement that the money changing hands tonight represents something more than simple finance. It represents an entire community of women who have decided, deliberately and collectively, that no family among them should face the worst moments of life entirely alone, unsupported by anything beyond their own individual insufficient resources. You walk home from the church basement with the particular calm that comes from knowing a safety net exists beneath you, however modest, built by women exactly like yourself, sustained by women exactly like yourself, waiting quietly in reserve for whichever family needs it next. The Extension Office has set up its portable canning equipment in the Grange Hall this week, an enormous steel pressure canner and a row of long tables, and for 3 days running, women from across the county have been arriving with baskets of produce, some their own, some gleaned from farms where the harvest exceeded what any single family could use before it spoiled. This is a community canning demonstration, organized by the same extension agents who first brought the curb market to formal life, and it serves 2 purposes at once. Teaching proper, safe canning technique to women who might otherwise learn it, if at all, through nothing but trial and occasionally dangerous error, and putting up an enormous quantity of food that will, over the following months, be distributed to families across the county facing genuine hunger. You have come today with a bushel of green beans from your own garden, more than your family could possibly use before they spoiled, and you spend the better part of the afternoon working alongside a dozen other women, washing, snapping, and packing beans into jars under the watchful eye of the county home demonstration agent, a brisk, capable woman named Miss Everly, who has clearly canned more vegetables in her professional life than most people eat in several lifetimes. She moves between the tables correcting technique with a gentle but unmistakable authority, checking that jars are properly sealed, that the pressure canner is being operated safely, that no shortcut is being taken that might, months from now, result in a family falling seriously ill from improperly preserved food. This kind of formal, government-sponsored education represented something genuinely new in the lives of many rural and working women, a recognition arriving finally from official channels that the domestic skills women had always practiced deserved actual technical instruction and actual institutional support. Before these extension programs existed in their current organized form, canning knowledge passed, as so much domestic knowledge did, from mother to daughter, refined through generations of informal trial and error, with real risk attached to any gap in that inherited knowledge. Miss Everly and her counterparts across the country's extension offices brought something closer to scientific rigor to this ancient household task, testing processing times, documenting safe procedures, and then teaching that knowledge systematically to any woman willing to spend an afternoon in a Grange hall learning it properly. The jars produced today, hundreds of them by the time the 3 days conclude, will not all go home with the women who canned them. A significant portion is set aside deliberately for distribution through the County Relief Office. Food that exists specifically because this community, gathered together for 3 days in a Grange hall, decided collectively to preserve more than any individual family strictly needed, understanding that the surplus would find its way to families with far less than that. This is mutual aid organized at a slightly larger scale than the church basement soup pot, involving the formal machinery of county government, and yet built on exactly the same underlying principle: women's collective labor, applied deliberately and skillfully, converting available raw material into food security for the whole community rather than simply for their own individual households. There is real satisfaction working alongside a dozen other women toward this shared purpose that differs from the quieter, more solitary satisfaction of canning your own family's harvest alone in your own kitchen. The Grange hall today is loud with conversation and the clatter of jars and lids, women exchanging technique and gossip in equal measure, the whole enormous undertaking accomplished through nothing more than a shared willingness to give up 3 days of individually scarce time in service of a collective goal. By the time the light begins to fade on the third afternoon, the tables that held raw produce this morning are instead lined with row upon row of sealed cooling jars, an entire winter's worth of security for a great many families produced through nothing more than organized, collective, largely unpaid female labor. Miss Everly, packing away her pressure canner at the end of the third day, mentions to you, almost in passing, that this demonstration alone will likely put up enough preserved food to meaningfully supplement the diets of perhaps 200 families across the county through the coming winter, a number that startles you slightly when you hear it stated so plainly. A concrete measure of exactly how much collective female labor, organized well and applied with genuine skill, can actually accomplish in the space of a single long weekend. You carry your own share of finished jars home in the same basket that brought the raw beans this morning, considerably heavier now, and you find yourself thinking, on the walk back, about how much of this county's true resilience through these hard years has depended on exactly this kind of organized, collective female effort, largely invisible to any official accounting of the local economy, and yet more responsible than almost anything else for the simple fact that far fewer families here have gone truly hungry than might otherwise have been the case. There is something to be said for the particular kind of quiet you carry home after 3 days spent working shoulder to shoulder with a dozen other capable women toward a purpose larger than any one household, a quiet that has very little to do with rest and a great deal to do with the settled, satisfied knowledge of genuine work well done. Your daughter is 11 now, old enough that you have begun this past year to fold her gradually into the actual work of this hidden economy rather than simply keeping her occupied nearby while you do it yourself. She sits beside you most evenings at the sewing machine, watching first, then attempting simple seams of her own on scraps too small for anything but practice, her small hands still clumsy with the treadle but improving week by week in a way that gives you a particular satisfaction you have not entirely examined until now. This transmission of skill from mother to daughter, so ordinary that it rarely occurs to anyone to name it as a formal kind of education, has always been the primary mechanism by which the domestic economy sustains and renews itself generation after generation, without a single classroom or textbook or certified instructor involved anywhere in the process. What you are teaching your daughter evening by evening at this sewing machine is not merely how to mend a hem or piece together a simple garment. You are teaching her an entire body of practical knowledge, encompassing budgeting and bartering and the careful reading of other people's character and need. That will, if this hard decade continues or if another one like it eventually arrives, serve her every bit as reliably as it has served you. There is a particular weight to this teaching that you feel more acutely these past few years than you might have in an easier decade. In gentler times, these skills might have been taught simply as pleasant domestic accomplishment, nice to have, but not strictly essential to a family's survival. In these years, you understand with complete clarity that what you are passing to your daughter is nothing less than a survival curriculum, the accumulated practical wisdom of exactly how a woman keeps a family fed and housed and clothed when the official economy has failed to do its part. You do not say this to her directly, not in those stark terms. An 11-year-old girl does not need the full weight of that reality laid across her narrow shoulders all at once, but you feel it every evening as you guide her small hands through another careful seam. The teaching goes well beyond the sewing machine, though that remains perhaps the most visible piece of it. She accompanies you to the curb market now most Tuesdays, learning to judge the freshness of eggs by holding them to the light, learning the particular etiquette of the market, when to hold firm on a price, and when a small concession keeps a good customer returning. She has begun helping with the household ledger too, the visible one kept in the kitchen drawer rather than the second tin hidden behind the flour, adding simple columns of figures under your careful supervision, learning the discipline of tracking every dollar in and every dollar out that has become, for you, as automatic as breathing. What strikes you most, watching her slowly absorb this entire body of knowledge, is how completely undervalued it remains in the wider world's eyes, even as you understand, with complete personal certainty, how essential it actually is. No school in this town offers a course in what you are teaching your daughter each evening. No diploma will ever certify her competence in it. And yet you know, watching her hands grow steadier at the machine week by week, that you are equipping her with something that may matter more to her eventual survival and to the survival of whatever family she someday builds herself than nearly anything the actual schoolhouse down the road will manage to teach her. There is a particular pride, too, distinct from any other kind you have experienced, in watching a skill you worked years to develop begin to take root in someone else's hands, in someone else's mind, someone who will carry it forward long after you are no longer here to demonstrate it yourself. This is, in its own quiet way, a kind of inheritance, passed not through any will or legal document, but through nothing more formal than shared evening hours at a sewing machine, through a dozen small corrections offered gently at the curb market, through the patient, repeated demonstration of exactly how a woman builds and manages an entire hidden economy that the wider world has never bothered to properly name. Your daughter's seams this evening are noticeably straighter than they were even a month ago, and you tell her so, watching the small, proud flush that spreads across her face at the praise. She does not yet understand, not fully, exactly what she is building toward, this slow accumulation of skill and judgment that will, someday, allow her to run a household and a hidden economy of her own with the same quiet competence you have spent these hard years developing. But she is building toward it all the same, one careful evening seam at a time, and you find a genuine, steadying comfort in knowing that whatever this decade eventually asks of her, she will not face it entirely unequipped. The frame goes up in Mrs. Okafor's front room every few weeks, an enormous wooden rectangle balanced on the backs of 4 kitchen chairs, and by mid-morning it is surrounded by women bent over their needles, working a single enormous quilt from every direction at once, section by section, toward the center. Quilting, unlike the mending and piecework that fills most Thursday afternoons, produces something larger than any single household could easily manage alone, and that scale is precisely the point. Quilts made this way, collectively, stitch by stitch, around a shared frame, are not simply warmer or more decorative than anything a single woman could produce working by herself in the scraps of time available between other chores. They represent a different kind of economy entirely, one built on pooled labor applied toward a shared goal, whether that goal is a wedding gift for a daughter about to leave the household, a genuine necessity for a family that has lost everything to fire or flood, or simply the practical need to convert a household's accumulated scrap fabric, saved and sorted for months, into something warm enough to see a family through another hard winter. The frame itself moves from house to house across the neighborhood, whichever front room happens to have space enough this particular week, and the women who gather around it shift slightly from gathering to gathering, though a reliable core, yourself among them, appears nearly every time. What strikes you, working your section of today's quilt alongside 5 other women, is how much genuine skill and coordination this collective work actually requires, skill that goes almost entirely unrecognized outside this room. Each woman's stitches must match the tension and spacing of her neighbors closely enough that the finished quilt reads as a single unified piece rather than a patchwork of visibly different hands, a standard maintained not through any formal instruction but through years of shared practice and the occasional gentle correction passed quietly between women who have worked this same frame together many times before. There is a genuine, if entirely unspoken, apprenticeship happening even here, among grown women who have all sewn for decades, each gathering refining everyone's technique just slightly through the simple act of working so closely alongside one another. Today's quilt is destined for the Alvarez family, whose house burned 3 weeks ago, a fire that started, as these things so often do, in a faulty stovepipe and left them with nothing beyond what neighbors have since gathered to replace. The quilt taking shape beneath your hands this morning will keep 3 children warm through the remainder of this winter, made entirely from donated scraps, assembled entirely through donated labor, distributed entirely outside any formal charity or relief office, and it will very likely be finished, bound and ready to deliver before the week is through, an entire family's winter warmth produced from nothing more than a shared frame and a morning's collective effort. You think, guiding your needle through another careful stitch, about how many quilts exactly like this one have moved through this neighborhood over the years, warming families through hardship after hardship, each one a small, tangible monument to exactly the kind of collective female labor that built so much of this hidden economy, freely given, quietly essential, and entirely unmeasured by anyone keeping the country's official books. The small wooden box beside the stove holds perhaps 60 recipe cards, most in your own hand, several in your mother's older, more formal script, and a growing number in the handwriting of neighbors who have shared over these hard years exactly the kind of practical culinary knowledge that has become essential to keeping a family fed on a fraction of what it once cost. This box, too, is part of the hidden economy, a quiet exchange of information that saves real money every single week, though no coin ever changes hands over it directly. These years produced, out of pure necessity, an entire informal cuisine of stretching and substitution, refined collectively by women sharing tips over back fences and church basements every bit as readily as they shared news through the Whisper network. Evaporated milk, considerably cheaper than fresh cream and shelf-stable besides, found its way into recipe after recipe, where cream would once have been assumed. A single egg, beaten thoroughly and stretched with a careful proportion of milk and flour, could bind together a whole casserole where 2 or 3 eggs might once have been used without a second thought. Meat, when it appeared at all in a weeknight meal, was more often a flavoring folded through a dish built primarily from beans or potatoes than the centerpiece it had been in easier years, and an entire vocabulary of new dishes, casseroles and hashes and thrifty soups, spread neighborhood to neighborhood, kitchen to kitchen, each woman contributing some small improvement or variation before passing the recipe forward again. You traded a recipe for meatless Friday stew built almost entirely from root vegetables and a careful blend of dried herbs to Mrs. Kowalski just last month, in exchange for her own trick for stretching a single pound of ground meat across an entire week's worth of suppers, folding it in small quantities through rice and beans and a rotating cast of vegetables so that no single meal felt repetitive despite the same modest pound of meat quietly anchoring each one. This kind of direct knowledge trade, recipe for recipe, technique for technique, moved as steadily through this neighborhood as any exchange of goods, and its value, though impossible to calculate in exact dollars, was genuinely substantial. The difference between a family's food budget stretching comfortably through the week and running short 2 days before payday. Home economics extension offices contributed their own steady stream of guidance to this collective knowledge, publishing thrifty recipe pamphlets distributed freely at the same curb markets and canning demonstrations that structured so much of the week's other economic activity, testing and refining substitutions with the same careful rigor Miss Everly brought to her canning instruction. But the pamphlets, however useful, never fully replaced the more personal, more immediate knowledge passed directly between neighbors, adjusted always to whatever a particular family actually had on hand, whatever a particular garden had actually produced that season, whatever a particular household's particular children would and would not eat without complaint. You add today's new recipe, a cabbage and potato dish Mrs. Fenwick shared just yesterday, to the wooden box beside the stove, written out carefully in your own steady hand, ready to be shared forward in turn whenever the right conversation arises. The box grows slowly heavier with each passing month, an accumulating record of an entire community's collective ingenuity, built recipe by recipe, exchange by exchange, into one of the quieter but no less essential threads of the whole hidden economy holding this street together. Every morning at 7:30, 3 children from 2 different households arrive at old Mrs. Petrov's front door, deposited there by mothers already hurrying off toward the curb market or the sewing room on Elm Street or whatever other piece of the hidden economy demands their morning, and Mrs. Petrov, widowed these past 11 years and long past the age of raising children of her own, folds them into her care for the day without ever once accepting payment beyond the occasional jar of preserves or bundle of mending pressed gratefully into her hands. This quiet, informal childcare network, built almost entirely on the willing labor of grandmothers and elderly widows with time to spare, and in Mrs. Petrov's case, a genuine, evident hunger for the company of children, now that her own grown daughters have scattered to towns too far away for regular visits, represents one of the most essential and least visible pieces of the entire hidden economy. Without it, women like Mrs. Kowalski and Mrs. Fenwick, whose own working days depend entirely on hours spent away from home at the curb market or the sewing room, would simply have no way to pursue that income at all, their own economic contribution collapsing entirely for want of somewhere safe to leave a young child for the morning. Mrs. Petrov herself would resist firmly any suggestion that what she provides constitutes real work in the way a paid position downtown might, and yet the value of it, calculated honestly, is not small. A formal childminder, had such a thing existed for families in this neighborhood's circumstances, would have charged fees that would have swallowed a meaningful portion of exactly the income her free care makes possible in the first place. Instead, she offers this care freely, motivated by a combination of genuine affection for the children themselves and a clear-eyed understanding, born of her own younger years spent building exactly this same kind of hidden economy herself, of precisely how essential this particular piece of support is to the mothers depending on it. The children in her care spend their mornings folded into whatever small tasks and quiet games Mrs. Petrov's own limited energy can sustain, learning simple stitches alongside her at the sewing machine, helping shell peas or snap beans when the season calls for it, absorbing, almost without anyone intending it as instruction, the same accumulated domestic knowledge that flows through every other corner of this hidden economy. By the time their own mothers collect them again in the late afternoon, tired from a full day at the market or the sewing room, the children have absorbed a small but genuine piece of the very same education their mothers received a generation earlier, passed forward now through a grandmother's patient, unpaid morning care. There is an entire invisible chain here worth pausing over. One generation of women's free labor enabling the next generation's income-earning labor, which will, in its turn, likely support a third generation's care when these same children grow old enough to mind younger cousins of their own. None of it appears anywhere in the official record of how this neighborhood survived its hardest years, and yet remove any single link in that chain, remove Mrs. Petrov's quiet morning generosity specifically, and the whole careful structure of curb markets and sewing rooms and piecework income that depends on mothers having somewhere safe to leave their children would simply cease to function for the families relying on it most. You collect your own youngest from Mrs. Petrov's front room most afternoons, and you never fail to notice, walking home together, how thoroughly and how happily the day has been spent. Further quiet evidence of exactly how much this entire hidden economy depends at every level on women supporting other women freely and without formal recognition, so that the whole fragile structure might continue holding steady for one more day. A small tin, separate entirely from the two already living behind your flower, sits at the very back of the highest shelf, reached only on the rare occasion you have a coin to spare for it, and it holds, this late in the year, just over $3, painstakingly accumulated a nickel and a dime at a time since the previous January, set aside specifically and only for Christmas. This third tin represents a discipline that many women across the country practice deliberately during these hard years, often formalized through Christmas savings clubs run by local banks and merchants specifically to help families set aside small, regular sums throughout the year rather than facing the holiday season with nothing at all in reserve. Some banks issued a small coupon book, one slot for each week of the year, encouraging depositors to contribute a set amount weekly toward a fund that would be released all at once in the first weeks of December, timed precisely to let struggling families provide at least some small measure of Christmas warmth for children who understood, better than their parents perhaps realized, exactly how hard this particular year had been. You have never trusted the bank's own formal club, preferring instead your own private version of the same discipline, a coin dropped into this third tin whenever the week's accounting allowed for it, entirely independent of any institution that might, as banks across the country had proven all too willing to do these past few years, simply fail and take the accumulated savings down with it. Your own tin answers to no one but you, and though it grows more slowly and less predictably than a formal savings club might encourage, it grows with a security that feels, given everything these hard years have taught you about institutions and their fragility, considerably more valuable than any interest a bank might have offered in exchange for your trust. The $3 accumulated so far will not buy much, not in any ordinary sense, but you have learned across these hard years to make $3 stretch further than it has any obvious right to stretch. A length of ribbon and a few yards of flannel, purchased carefully and sewn into simple but genuinely warm nightclothes for each of the children. A small bag of hard candy, a rare enough treat this year that its appearance alone will likely be remembered as the highlight of the whole holiday. Perhaps, if the fund grows just slightly further before December arrives, a single small toy for the youngest, who has not yet reached the age where he fully understands why this particular Christmas, like the two before it, will look considerably more modest than the ones his older siblings remember from before the crash. There is a particular tenderness folded into this small, separate discipline, distinct from the harder, more urgent calculations governing the two tins behind the flower. Those tins exist to keep the family fed and housed, matters of genuine survival that leave little room for sentiment. This third tin exists for something else entirely, for the specific, deliberate choice to preserve some small measure of joy and wonder for your children even in the hardest of years, a choice that costs real sacrifice elsewhere in an already stretched budget and that you make gladly, every single week, one careful coin at a time. You add a dime to the tin tonight, the week's small surplus, and return it to its place at the very back of the highest shelf, already beginning, in the quiet way you have learned to do with every other piece of this hidden economy, to calculate exactly how far $3 and change might stretch by the time December finally arrives, and exactly what particular small wonder you might manage to conjure from it for each of the children sleeping soundly upstairs. Once a month, a small parcel goes out from this house addressed to your husband's mother, 2 counties over, on a farm that has fared considerably worse these past few years than your own household has managed. Inside, wrapped carefully against the journey, go a few jars of preserves, a length of the good flannel you have not quite found use for yourself, and tucked into a fold of paper where it will not shift or go missing in transit, whatever small sum of cash the month's accounting can spare, usually no more than $1 or $2, sent not because your own household has surplus to spare, but because you have learned, watching your mother-in-law's letters arrive month after month, exactly how much even a small, steady contribution can mean to a household with even less than your own. This quiet flow of support between households, moving not just within a single neighborhood but across whole counties and sometimes across state lines entirely, connecting struggling urban and small-town families to even more struggling rural relatives, represents another largely invisible thread in the whole hidden economy of these hard years. Extended families, drawn closer together by shared hardship in a way easier times had perhaps allowed to loosen, developed their own informal systems of mutual support. A niece in town sending home whatever small surplus her own careful economy produced. A rural aunt sending back, in exchange, whatever the farm's own harvest could spare. Eggs and butter and preserved vegetables that a town household, however resourceful, could rarely produce in quite the same abundance. Managing this flow of support fell, as so much else in this hidden economy did, almost entirely to the women in each household, corresponding regularly by letter to coordinate exactly what each family could spare and exactly what each family most urgently needed. A whole informal logistics operation conducted through nothing more sophisticated than careful handwriting and the reliable, if occasionally slow, service of the rural mail carrier. You have become, across these hard years, a genuinely skilled correspondent in this particular sense, learning to read between the careful, proud lines of your mother-in-law's letters for the true extent of her household's need, since she would never, out of the same stubborn pride that runs through nearly every household on this street, simply state that need outright. The letters themselves have become their own small, essential piece of this economy, carrying not just goods and money, but the Whisper Network's own information, extended now across a much wider geography, news of which relatives have found steady work, which have lost it. Which small piece of advice or technique might help a struggling household 2 counties over weather its own particular version of this same hard decade. You have shared, through these letters, several of the same thrifty recipes traded so freely through your own neighborhood's recipe box economy, and received back, in turn, farm-specific knowledge about food preservation and animal husbandry that has proven useful in ways your own more urban upbringing never quite prepared you for. There is a particular calculation involved in deciding, each month, exactly how much your own household can genuinely spare for this wider network of support, a calculation complicated by the fact that your own family's needs, however real, rarely feel as urgent sitting at your own well-stocked kitchen table as the needs described, however carefully understated, in your mother-in-law's most recent letter. You have learned to hold both truths at once. Your own household's genuine tightness and the wider family's even greater need, finding, most months, some small further sacrifice that lets you send a little more than strict prudence alone might dictate. This wider network of family support, multiplied across countless households exactly like your own, moved real resources across the entire country during these hard years in patterns that no official relief program ever formally tracked or organized, a genuine second circulatory system running parallel to and largely independent of anything Washington had devised, built entirely on family loyalty and the same patient, careful correspondence that has connected struggling households to their struggling relatives since long before this particular decade ever began. You seal tonight's parcel carefully, address it in your own steady hand, and set it by the door, ready for tomorrow's walk to the post office. One more small, essential thread in a whole country's worth of quiet, invisible mutual support, family bound to family, household bound to household, across whatever distance this hard decade has placed between them. When the telephone does ring with your own household's pattern, 2 longs and a short, it is very often Central herself on the other end before the actual call connects, a young woman named Alice, who has worked the town's switchboard for going on 4 years now and who has become, through the simple accumulated experience of connecting nearly every call this town makes, one of the most quietly well-informed people in the entire community. Switchboard operators of this era occupied a peculiar and genuinely important position within the whole informal economy of information that ran through towns like this one, sitting at the literal center of every conversation the town's telephone lines carried, in a position to notice, whether she wished to or not, patterns that no one else in town could easily observe. Alice would never dream of repeating the actual content of a private call, a discretion that was both a matter of professional ethics and, quite practically, a condition of keeping her position at all. But the simple patterns of who was calling whom, and how urgently, and how often, told their own quiet story that a sharp, observant operator like Alice could read almost as clearly as if the calls themselves had been shared with her directly. It was Alice, in fact, who first noticed, weeks before the Sewing Circle's own Whisper Network caught wind of it, that calls to the doctor's office from out along the county road had increased sharply, a pattern that turned out to trace back to a lingering illness moving quietly through one of the more isolated farm families. A family too proud and too far from town to have otherwise let their trouble be known. Alice mentioned this carefully and without specifics to her own mother, who mentioned it in turn to the lady's aide, and within the week a discreet delivery of food and a volunteer visit from Mrs. Reyes had reached that isolated farmhouse, entirely because a young telephone operator had noticed a pattern in call volume that no one else in town was positioned to see. This kind of information work, performed by women in positions like Alice's across the country, rarely receives any credit in accounts of how communities managed to look after their own during these hard years, and yet it represented a genuinely important extension of the same whisper network that ran more visibly through backyard fences and church basements. Alice's position paid her an actual formal wage, one of a shrinking number of respectable paid positions genuinely open to a young unmarried woman in this era, and she performed the technical duties of that position with real skill, connecting calls quickly and accurately across a switchboard that demanded real concentration and dexterity to operate well. But the informal service she provided alongside those formal duties, the careful, discreet noticing of patterns that let genuine need reach the community's attention before a crisis fully developed, was itself a form of unpaid, unrecognized labor layered on top of her paid position, exactly the same pattern that ran through so much of this hidden economy. You think of Alice sometimes, sitting at her switchboard downtown through long shifts that stretch well into the evening, connecting call after call, holding within her own careful discretion an entire town's worth of quiet information that she will mostly never share, and that shapes, all the same, in small, invisible ways, exactly how quickly this community notices and responds to its own members' struggles. She is, in her own particular way, as essential a node in this hidden economy as the grocer with his marbled ledger or Mrs. Hollis with her steady needle, though her own contribution runs through copper wire rather than through cloth or credit, and though almost no one in this town, apart from her own mother and perhaps a handful of others who have pieced together the pattern the way you have tonight, has ever thought to name it as the genuine essential service it actually is. It is late now, later than you usually allow yourself to sit awake, but the house is finally quiet, the children asleep, your husband asleep beside them, in the way exhausted men sleep, deeply and without dreams they will ever remember. You sit alone at the kitchen table with both tins open in front of you, the visible one and the hidden one, and for once you allow yourself the small luxury of adding up properly and completely exactly what this month's second economy has produced. Egg and butter money from the curb market, piecework wages from the shirtwaist factory, Mr. Averill's board, the government wage from the sewing room on Elm Street, small trades and exchanges from the sewing circle that never touched cash at all but that saved real money all the same, mending you would otherwise have paid for, produce you received in trade rather than purchasing outright. When you finish the sum, sitting quietly in the lamplight with the pencil still in your hand, the number surprises you, not because you doubted it existed, but because seeing it written plainly, all in one place, makes visible something you have always known only in fragments, scattered across a dozen separate transactions throughout the month. This month, by your own careful accounting, the second economy generated very nearly as much as your husband's own wages did. Some months, in the leaner stretches when his hours have been cut hardest, it has generated more. This is not a small or incidental contribution to the household's survival, tucked modestly around the edges of his own more substantial earning. It is, in the strictest and most honest accounting, very nearly half of everything this family has, produced through labor that has never once appeared on any government survey, never been counted by any economist studying the shape and depth of this depression, never been acknowledged, if you are entirely honest with yourself, by the man sleeping soundly upstairs who believes, in the uncomplicated way men of his generation are permitted to believe such things, that his own wages are what keep this family fed. You are not alone in this. You know this with the same certainty you know the weight of a full water bucket, the same certainty that comes from years spent among other women doing exactly this same invisible arithmetic in exactly this same quiet way. The sewing circle, the curb market, the whisper network, the mutual benefit society, every piece of this hidden economy you move through week after week is populated by women performing exactly this same calculation in their own kitchens late at night after their own households have finally gone quiet. Multiply your own modest sum by every woman on this street, in this town, across this whole struggling country, and the true scale of what women's invisible labor contributed to the nation's survival through these hard years becomes almost impossible to properly grasp. The official story of this decade, the one that will eventually be written in newspapers and someday in history books, will center on men. It will speak of unemployed factory workers and displaced farmers, of breadlines and shanty towns, and the slow, halting recovery of formal industrial employment. This is not a false story. It is simply an incomplete one, and the incompleteness is not accidental. The instruments used to measure this decade's economic catastrophe were built from the ground up to see only certain kinds of labor performed for a formal wage, in a formal workplace, under a formal employer. Everything you do, everything every woman on this street does, falls outside that narrow frame entirely. Not because it lacks value, but because the people who built the frame never thought to make it wide enough to include work performed by women in their own kitchens and gardens and front rooms. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes with sitting alone in a quiet kitchen at this hour, doing this exact sum that you rarely allow yourself during the busy daylight hours when the actual labor is happening rather than being counted. You understand, with a plainness that almost startles you, that the story this country will eventually tell itself about how it survived this decade will largely omit the truth sitting right here on this slip of paper in front of you. Recovery, when it finally comes in full, will be credited to men returning to factory floors and construction sites, to public works programs building roads and bridges, to policies decided by men in Washington who rarely, if ever, considered how their decisions would actually reach a struggling household, or what kept that household functioning in the long months before any of those decisions bore fruit. You fold the slip of paper carefully and return both tins to their places, the visible one at the front of the shelf, the hidden one tucked behind the flower where it has always lived. Tomorrow the work begins again exactly as it always does, and the true accounting you have just performed will return to its usual invisible state, scattered back across a dozen separate transactions that no one, including you, will think to add up again until some similarly quiet night weeks from now. And yet something has shifted, sitting here in the lamplight with the true sum finally visible in your own hand. You know now, in a way you perhaps only half knew before, exactly how much this family owes to the tin behind the flower, exactly how much this whole struggling country owes to women exactly like you, performing exactly this same invisible arithmetic in kitchens up and down every street in every town this decade has touched. It will not be written down anywhere that matters, but you know it, and that, on this particular quiet night, feels like it might have to be enough. Not every household on this street includes a husband at all, and it would be a mistake to imagine that the hidden economy exists only as a supplement to a man's wages, a helpful second income tucked quietly around the edges of the family's primary support. For Mrs. Fenwick, 3 streets over, widowed just before the crash took hold in earnest, this same hidden economy is not supplementary at all. It is the entire household's survival, the whole of it, built and sustained through nothing but her own labor and judgment, with no second wage anywhere in the picture to fall back on. She has managed this, these past several years, by combining nearly every strand of the informal economy that other women on this street practice only in part. She takes in 2 boarders rather than 1, having converted both her spare rooms rather than just a single unused space. She sews piecework in the evenings, sells at the curb market on the same Tuesday and Saturday schedule as everyone else, and has, in the past year, added a small side trade in preserved goods, selling not just her own surplus but purchasing produce from farms outside town at a modest wholesale rate and canning it herself for resale at a markup that, while never large, adds up steadily across a full season. What makes Mrs. Fenwick's situation instructive, watching from the outside, is how clearly it reveals something that remains only partially visible in households like your own, where a husband's wages sit alongside the second economy and make it easy even for the woman herself to think of her own labor as merely supplemental. Mrs. Fenwick has no such comfortable illusion available to her. Every dollar in her household comes directly from her own combined efforts, and the sheer scale of what she has built, an actual working combination of boarding house, home industry, and small trading enterprise, makes plain exactly how substantial this hidden economy can be when a woman is required to build the whole of a household's survival from it rather than merely a helpful portion. She has become, by necessity, considerably more entrepreneurial than most of the other women on this street, willing to take on risks and expand into new small ventures that a woman with a second income to fall back on might never think to attempt. The wholesale produce trade, in particular, required an initial outlay of cash she did not entirely have to spare, borrowed carefully from the Burial Society's fund and repaid faithfully over several months once the first season's resale profits began coming in. This willingness to calculate risk carefully and then act on that calculation decisively, to treat her own household economy with the same seriousness a downtown businessman might bring to an actual company, sets her apart in a way the other women on this street have come to genuinely respect. You have watched her, on more than one occasion, negotiate directly with the farmers who supply her wholesale produce, holding her ground on price with a firmness that would surprise anyone who assumed, based on nothing more than her modest dress and her widow's careful economy, that she lacked any real business acumen. She does not lack it. She has simply never had the opportunity or the formal credential to exercise it anywhere the wider economy would recognize or reward. Her entire considerable talent for calculated risk, for negotiation, for the patient building of a genuinely diversified small enterprise exists and operates entirely within the confines of this same invisible economy that every other woman on this street participates in, only partially around the edges of a husband's more visible wage. There is a particular kind of respect that passes between you and Mrs. Fenwick when your paths cross at the curb market, a recognition of shared trade rather than simple neighborly friendliness. She has built something genuinely impressive out of pure necessity, and you understand, better than most, exactly how much skill and nerve that building required because you have watched, up close, exactly how demanding even your own partial participation in this same hidden economy proves to be week after week, and she has built the whole of a household's survival from precisely that same demanding, invisible labor multiplied several times over. If circumstances had been different, if the wider economy had ever thought to formally recognize and reward the particular combination of skills Mrs. Fenwick has developed, she would very likely be running a genuine, prosperous business downtown by now, complete with a storefront and a bank loan and a reputation known well beyond this street. Instead, she runs it from her own kitchen and her own converted spare rooms, invisible to every measure the wider economy uses to recognize genuine entrepreneurial success, and entirely, completely real all the same. The kitchen is warm again, though the rest of the house is not, and the light through the window has the same thin, grey quality it carried at the very beginning of this story, a winter morning arriving without ceremony, asking nothing except to be survived. You are standing where you stood then, at the same shelf, reaching past the same flour, and the second tin is exactly where you left it, filled now with a season's worth of eggs and mending and boarded rooms and government wages, a whole quiet history folded into coins and folded bills that no one downtown will ever think to count. It would be easy, telling this story only through its individual pieces, to lose sight of the whole shape of it, the sheer scale of what women exactly like you built during these hard years, almost entirely without recognition, almost entirely without a name for what they were doing. Consider it laid out plainly for a moment, the way you laid it out yourself that late night at the kitchen table. Household budgeting refined into a genuine discipline, skilled barter networks moving real value between neighbors with no bank involved at all, boarding arrangements that turned spare rooms into steady income, curb markets organized well enough to rival any downtown storefront, piecework sewn by lamplight for factories that never once considered the women producing their garments to be true employees, midwifery and informal medicine, keeping entire neighborhoods healthy at a fraction of what the hospital downtown would have charged. A whole recycling economy of rags and bones and rendered fat, converting waste into both savings and income, grocers' running accounts and, in some towns, entire local currencies, sustained by nothing more than careful patient trust, a whisper network moving essential information faster and more accurately than any official channel managed. Government sewing rooms, finally, belatedly, paying women an actual formal wage for skills they had always possessed. Church basements simmering with mutual aid, mutual benefit societies functioning as genuine insurance companies, laundry businesses and door-to-door sales routes and community canning kitchens preserving a whole county's winter security in a single long weekend. Widows building entire diversified small enterprises from nothing but their own combined skill and nerve. And underneath all of it, running quietly through every single piece, mothers teaching daughters, passing this entire invisible curriculum forward, generation to generation, so that the knowledge itself would never be lost, whatever this decade or the next one might eventually demand of it. None of this appeared in the unemployment figures. None of it appeared in the newspaper accounts of the Depression's slow, uneven recovery, accounts that focused, understandably enough in their own narrow way, on factory floors reopening and construction crews returning to public works projects, on the visible, countable return of men to visible, countable jobs. When historians eventually turned their attention, years later, to what had actually kept millions of struggling families fed and housed through the very worst of these years, they would find, again and again, this same hidden pattern, an entire second economy, built and run almost exclusively by women, generating real value that simply never registered on any instrument designed to measure the nation's economic health. There is a particular kind of quiet justice in finally naming this, even here, even now, in a kitchen that no historian will ever visit, speaking only to yourself in the grey light of a winter morning. The recovery, when it finally came in full, would be credited to men, and in the most visible official sense, that credit would not be entirely wrong. But recovery assumes a foundation to recover onto, a family still intact, still housed, still fed, still capable of returning to ordinary life once the wider economy finally turned. That foundation, in household after household, street after street, town after town, was built and maintained by women through years when the official economy had nothing at all to offer them, no wage, no program, no acknowledgement beyond the vague, unexamined assumption that of course the household would simply continue functioning because it always had, because women would simply make certain that it did. You close the tin now, slide it back behind the flour where it has always lived, and you do not resent this quiet, this lack of recognition, not exactly, though there is a complicated weight to it that you have never quite found the right words to describe, even to yourself, even in the privacy of your own late-night reckoning. What you feel instead, standing in this kitchen with the whole hidden history of these years settled quietly around you, is something closer to a private, unshakable certainty. You know what you built. The women up and down this street know what they built. Together, out of nothing more than skill and trust, and a stubborn refusal to let their families fall, even when the wider world offered them almost nothing to build it with. Someday, perhaps, this whole hidden history will be written properly, gathered from 1,000 kitchens exactly like this one, and finally given its true weight and its true name. Perhaps it will take decades, perhaps it will take longer than that, but the truth of it does not depend on when or whether anyone downtown finally gets around to counting it properly. The truth of it is sitting right here, behind the flour, in every coffee tin, on every shelf, in every kitchen on this whole quiet street, real and complete and entirely unbothered by how long it takes the rest of the world to notice. The morning is fully arrived now, the grey light warming slowly towards something gentler, and somewhere upstairs the house is beginning to stir, footsteps, a child's sleepy voice, the ordinary sounds of a family waking into another day that will look to anyone glancing in from outside, exactly like every other day this hard decade has offered. They will not see the second tin. They will not see the whole invisible architecture holding this household steady beneath the surface of its ordinary mornings. But you know it is there. You built it. And for now, in this last quiet moment before the day properly begins, that knowledge is enough to let your shoulders finally, fully soften, the way they have been wanting to soften since this long story first began. Let the kitchen grow quiet again in your mind now, the way it was at the very start, the coffee tin settled behind the flour, the grey light easing gently toward morning. There is nothing left to calculate tonight. The ledger is closed, the accounts are settled, and the whole hidden history you have just walked through can simply rest now exactly where it belongs, folded quietly into the walls of 1,000 kitchens, very much like this one. Word reached the sewing circle on a Thursday afternoon that the mill was cutting wages again, the third reduction in as many years, and by the following Monday morning, a group of perhaps 30 women, wives and mothers, and a handful of the mill's own female workers had gathered quietly at the gate before the morning shift began, not to picket exactly, nothing so formal or so likely to draw the attention of the sheriff, but simply to stand together, visibly, as the men filed in for another hard day's reduced wages. This kind of organized presence, women gathering deliberately outside a workplace to make their collective concern visible without ever crossing into anything the authorities might formally call a strike, became a familiar pattern in mill towns and factory districts across the country during these hard years, a form of pressure that operated in the space between formal labor organizing and simple neighborhood solidarity. The women's auxiliaries that grew up around several major labor actions of this era drew their strength precisely from this ambiguity, difficult for company management to dismiss outright as mere labor agitation, since the women gathered were, after all, simply wives and mothers concerned for their families, and yet unmistakably, powerfully organized all the same, coordinated through exactly the same networks of trust and communication that carried news of job openings and relief offices through the neighborhood. You stood among them that Monday morning, your own husband among the men filing past into the mill, and you felt something you had not quite expected to feel, a particular kind of collective strength that none of your individual daily labors, however essential, had ever quite produced on their own. The curb market and the sewing circle and the second tin behind your flour were all, in their way, solitary or small-scale endeavors, your own household's private survival strategy. This was different. 30 women standing together, visible and united, making a claim not just to their own household's survival, but to something larger, a shared demand that the mill's decisions account, at least somewhat, for the families those decisions actually affected. The mill's management, predictably, did not respond well to this visible display, and word came down within days that any worker whose wife had been seen at the Monday gathering should expect no leniency on the next round of layoffs. A threat delivered informally, never in writing, but understood clearly by everyone it was meant to reach. This is the genuine risk that accompanied this particular form of collective action, a risk that fell, as it so often did, disproportionately on the women themselves, who had no formal employment relationship with the mill to protect and no union, in most cases, willing to extend its formal protections to wives standing outside the gate rather than workers standing inside it. And yet the gatherings continued, week after week, growing gradually more organized as the women involved developed their own informal structure, a rotating group of coordinators who tracked which grievances mattered most to which families, who negotiated, eventually, a small and informal channel of communication with a sympathetic junior manager willing to at least hear their concerns even when he could do little to formally address them. It amounted, in the end, to something considerably less than a formal union, and yet something considerably more than simple passive endurance, a genuine exercise of collective female power operating almost entirely outside any framework the labor law of the era had been designed to recognize or protect. There is a particular kind of courage required for this work that differs from the quieter, more private courage the rest of this hidden economy demands. Selling eggs at the curb market risks little beyond a disappointing morning. Standing visibly at a factory gate, making your family's economic distress a public collective statement rather than a private household matter, risks something considerably more: the mill's displeasure, a husband's job security, the particular social discomfort of a community not entirely accustomed to seeing its women organize this openly. You felt that risk keenly, standing at the gate that first Monday morning, and you felt, alongside it, a fierce and unfamiliar satisfaction in taking it anyway, together with 30 other women who had decided, independently and then collectively, that private endurance alone was no longer sufficient response to what the mill kept asking their families to absorb. The wage cut, in the end, was only partially reversed, a small concession won through months of this patient, visible, collective pressure, hardly the full victory the women at the gate had originally hoped for. And yet the smaller triumph mattered enormously all the same, both for the modest additional income it restored to dozens of struggling households, and for the less tangible but equally real lesson it taught an entire neighborhood of women about the genuine power available to them when they chose, deliberately, to stand together rather than endure separately. Every other Friday evening, a man named Mr. Whitfield knocks at the door carrying a small leather ledger of his own, considerably more official-looking than Ruth's case of notions, and collects the modest weekly premium on the small industrial life insurance policy you have maintained faithfully for going on 6 years now. This is a policy you manage yourself, entirely separate from any decision your husband makes about the household's larger finances, a nickel or a dime set aside each week specifically to guarantee that, should the worst happen to either of you, the family left behind would not face a funeral entirely without resources beyond whatever the Burial Society's fund could provide. These small industrial policies, sold door to door by agents exactly like Mr. Whitfield, and collected in tiny weekly installments that even the poorest households could usually manage, represented one of the only forms of formal financial protection genuinely accessible to working-class families during these years, and the responsibility for maintaining them fell, in the great majority of households you know, squarely on the woman rather than the man. It is you who greets Mr. Whitfield at the door each collection evening. It is you who has kept the policy current through even the leanest weeks, understanding with a clarity your husband has never quite needed to develop that a lapsed policy, allowed to expire during some particularly hard month, would mean starting the whole slow accumulation of protection over again from nothing. The mathematics of this small weekly discipline are modest but genuinely meaningful, calculated carefully by Mr. Whitfield's company to ensure that even a family paying only a few cents a week will have accumulated over years of faithful payment, enough to cover a genuine funeral and leave a small remainder besides. You have watched, across the 6 years you have maintained this policy, the accumulated value grow slowly but steadily, a form of forced savings that operates somewhat differently from the second tin behind your flower, less flexible, entirely inaccessible for any purpose beyond its stated intent, and precisely because of that inflexibility, more reliably protected against the countless small temptations that might otherwise erode a more accessible fund during a particularly desperate week. Mr. Whitfield himself has become, across these 6 years of bi-weekly visits, something closer to a familiar fixture in the household's rhythm than a mere insurance agent, aware of your family's particular circumstances in a way that shapes gently how he manages the relationship. He has extended you a week's grace on more than one occasion when the collection evening arrived and the money simply was not there, understanding, from long experience serving families exactly like yours, that a single missed week reflects a hard patch rather than any genuine unwillingness to maintain the policy, and that a policy allowed to lapse over one difficult week represents a loss for his own company as much as for your family, since a lapsed policyholder rarely returns. There is a particular comfort in this small, steady discipline that goes beyond its stated financial purpose. In a decade defined, for your family and countless others, by constant uncertainty, by wages that rise and fall unpredictably, and expenses that arrive with no warning at all, this policy represents one of the very few things in your household's financial life that moves in a single, reliable direction, growing steadily week by week, regardless of what else the month has brought. You have come to value that steadiness for its own sake, quite apart from the protection it will eventually provide, a small, controllable certainty carved carefully out of a decade that has offered your family remarkably little certainty of any other kind. You count out the coins for Mr. Whitfield tonight, watching him mark the payment carefully in his own small ledger before tucking it away and continuing on to the next house on his collection route. Another family, another few coins, another week's worth of small, patient protection accumulated against whatever this hard decade might still have in store. The door closes behind him, and you return to the kitchen. One more small transaction folded quietly into the whole invisible architecture of financial management that has, across these hard years, become as thoroughly and completely your own responsibility as anything else in this house. Let the house settle now, the way it always does at the very end of a long day, the lamps dimming one by one, the last coals in the stove sinking slowly into a soft, quiet orange. The second tin has gone back behind the flour. The mending basket has gone back beside the chair. Mr. Averill's lamp has been checked, the sewing machine has gone still, and somewhere upstairs the whole household is finally fully asleep. You have walked tonight through an entire hidden world, one you may never have thought about quite this closely before, a whole invisible economy of eggs and mending and boarded rooms and quiet, patient trust, built and sustained almost entirely by women whose names never once appeared in the official record of these hard years. It was real. It mattered enormously to the families it kept fed and housed and quietly, steadily afloat. And it asks nothing more of you now than to let it settle gently into the back of your mind, the way the coals settle in the stove, still warm, still glowing faintly, no longer demanding anything at all. Before you drift off completely, one last small note, the same one from earlier, offered now without any urgency at all. This story, and the rest of the library it belongs to, lives on Spotify as well, in case some night soon you would rather simply listen than watch, the link waiting quietly in the description and pinned in the comments whenever you happen to want it. Before that, though, let it be said plainly one last time so it has a chance to settle properly before sleep takes you the rest of the way. Every part of this story, the tins behind the flour, the curb market mornings, the sewing circle and the burial society and the grandmothers minding children so their daughters could earn a living, all of it was real, lived by women whose names history mostly declined to record, and all of it deserves to be remembered as clearly as the breadlines and the shuttered factories usually are. That is the quiet debt this story has tried, in its own small way, to repay tonight. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If a small piece of this story is still drifting through your mind as you finally let go, here is a gentle thought to carry into sleep with you. Somewhere in your own family's history, there was very likely a woman keeping a second tin of her own, behind her own flour, in a kitchen you never got to see. If you ever learn her story or already know a piece of it, I would love to hear it whenever you have a quiet moment to share. Rest easy now. The kitchen is warm, the tin is full, and the whole quiet, hidden history you carried tonight has earned its place at last in the dark.